Honorable Professor Emeritus Dr. Osman Bakar, Rector of International Islamic University Malaysia, Professor Emeritus Dr. John Vall, Georgetown University, United States of America, respected University Management Committee members, panel presenters, Professor Dr. Hayun Ma, Professor Dr. Par Kim Bing, and Honorable Dato Abdul Majid Ahmad Khan, member of the IIUM Board of Governors, all honorable guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very good morning and warm welcome to everyone, both here in the Senate Hall and those tuning in via our online platform. On behalf of the organizers, we are honored to welcome you to this important international colloquium entitled Cosmopolitanism and Collaboration Across Civilizations in the Indian Ocean, Madani, Islamic-Confucian Dialogue, and Zheng's Maritime Legacy. Distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, respected scholars, students, and colleagues, thank you for joining us at the International Islamic University for what promises to be a rich and inspiring day of dialogue and exploration. Let us begin our program by reciting Surah Al-Fatiha. To officially begin our proceedings, we're pleased to present a special address by Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, the Honorable Prime Minister of Malaysia. This address has been specially recorded for today's colloquium.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Distinguished guests, esteemed scholars, and dear colleagues, I note particularly my dear friend, Rector, Professor Osman Bakar, and my distinguished colleague from Georgetown University, Professor John Vall. My deep appreciation for your commitment to strengthening the historical, cultural, and economic ties that unite the nations around the Indian Ocean. The values we celebrate today, inclusivity, diversity, partnership, and cooperation, have long been the foundations of great civilizations. These ideals are central to Malaysia's Madani framework, to the legacy of Admiral Zheng and the enduring connectivity of the Indian Ocean. The Madani vision draws inspiration from the Constitution of Madinah, Shafat al-Madinah, one of history's earliest models of pluralistic governance. Established by Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the 7th century Madinah, it provided a legal framework for coexistence, justice, and mutual respect among Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others. Madani embraces these same principles, emphasizing compassion, economic cooperation, and justice, and participatory and consulting governance. It looks at all members of the society as having a stake in shaping a just and prosperous future. These values were also exemplified by the great Admiral Zheng, whose voyages in the 15th century made him the foremost connector between China and the Indian Ocean world by way of Southeast Asia. From China to Southeast Asia and India to the Middle East and Africa, Zheng built relationships based on diplomacy, trade and cooperation, engaging in joint ventures with local rulers and promoting peaceful engagement. That legacy is preserved through the Zheng Forum, which serves as a platform for historical dialogue and international cooperation. The Indian Ocean has conjoined civilizations through commerce, knowledge, and shared aspirations. For centuries, traders, scholars, and diplomats crossed its waters, fostering intellectual and economic exchange. Today, we must draw inspiration from this rich past to address modern challenges, from climate change and maritime security to sustainable development and technological advancement. Zheng's diplomacy adopted cooperation over conflict and multilateralism over unilateralism as the Madani Constitution. We too must forge partnership that advance peace, inclusivity, and collective progress. I'm happy that the International Islamic University of Malaysia maintains a steadfast commitment to promoting dialogue, education, and cross-cultural exchange among the diverse peoples of the Indian Ocean. Institutions like it play an essential role in making a bridge between traditional wisdom and contemporary realities, in strengthening mutual understanding and in encouraging the development of a world rooted in cooperation and dedicated to unity. I urge you to take this opportunity to engage in meaningful discussions and collaboration. The principles of Madani, Zheng's legacy, and Indian Ocean connectivity remind us that our strength lies in partnership, our prosperity in inclusivity, and our future in working together. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sama-sama, Datuk Sri. We now move on to our keynote addresses. For the first keynote address, I welcome Professor Emeritus Dr. Osman Bakar, the Rector of IIUM. Dr. Osman is a globally renowned scholar in Islamic philosophy and inter-civilizational dialogue. He has published extensively on science and religion, interfaith understanding, and the intellectual legacy of Islam. Professor Osman Bakar has been a leading advocate for dialogue between Islamic and Confucian civilizations, emphasizing that both traditions offer rich moral and philosophical resources for the modern world. He approaches Islam and Confucianism not just as religions, but as civilizational frameworks that promote ethical living, social harmony, and intellectual cultivation. For him, the convergence of their core values, such as compassion, rahmah, in Islam, or ren in Confucianism, forms a strong foundation for mutual understanding. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Osman Bakar.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister MC. Professor John Wall, my former colleague at Georgetown University, who is now online in Washington, DC. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here. Members of the University Management Committee, our panel speakers today, Professor Dr. Haiyun Ma on my left, who is the head of the Zheng Forum based in the United States. But I understand he's contemplating on moving to Malaysia. Most welcome. And together Professor Datuk Majid, our former Malaysian ambassador to Beijing, who is also the chairman of the Malaysia-China Friendship Society, Professor Farr on my right. He's also one of the speakers. Professor Farr is currently Professor of ASEAN Studies at IIUM. He's writing a lot now on ASEAN. And of course, Dr. Majid, who is also a member of the board of governors of IIUM. And professors, fellow professors, distinguished guests, colleagues from different strata of society, thank you very much for kindly attending this event. It's only half a day, but it is very, very significant as I see it. As by way of introduction, first of all, I would like again to thank Professor John Wall, a famous historian of our times, who is very knowledgeable about contemporary Islam, not only in Malaysia, but also in Southeast Asia. I was fortunate to work with him for 5 years together when I was the second holder of the Malaysia Chair of Islam in Southeast Asia. The first one was the former rector of this university, Allahyarham Professor Tan Sri Muhammad Kamal Hassan. He was the first holder. I was the second. And I want to mention this. When I was at Georgetown, I received very much a lot of encouragement from Professor Wall regarding which subject I should teach at Georgetown. Altogether, I taught 4 different courses, but I just want to mention one of them. It's a full-fledged course on inter-civilizational dialogue in Southeast Asia. He told me no other university in America has taught that course as a full-fledged subject, and I did. So it is relevant. I mean, what I thought then is relevant to what we are going to discuss today, because I think if you look here at the basically, if you look carefully at the topic, at the theme of the conference, right? The basically cosmopolitanism and collaboration across civilization in the Indian Ocean. So there, in the main title, the main theme of the conference, you will see the words cosmopolitanism, which is a loaded word. All right, it's a big idea. And then collaboration across civilization, which is just another way of saying inter-civilizational collaboration, partnership. And then in the subtitle, you have the word Madani. Again, it's a very big idea. Islam-Confucianism dialogue is a big idea. Zheng's maritime legacy, there's another big issue. So when I look at the theme, actually this is the work of where's Professor Hayun Ma, yeah, and Datuk Majid, because this is the Shanghai, they provide many that one. So I said, oh, these are all big ideas, very big ideas. So I thought, no, why not I take this opportunity before I talk about those ideas? Aren't we having a festival of ideas? Yeah. I want to mention the word festival of ideas because the Madani government headed by Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has launched a new program called Festival of Ideas. And the ministry which is championing this Festival of Ideas is the Ministry of Higher Education, KPT. And recently, I was told by colleagues that the Ministry of Higher Education wants each of the universities, public universities, to organize a mini festival of ideas. Well, I would say that today we are celebrating this festival of ideas, given the kind of ideas that we have to talk about today. But I would say here, as a rector of the university, even before that, before we received this kind of information from the ministry, in October, after 1 month becoming rector of this university, I delivered this inaugural lecture talking about Tawhidic epistemology. And to me, there's no other bigger idea than that, than the Tawhidic epistemology. Anyway, basically here, given the theme of the conference, so basically we are talking about big ideas about the Indian Ocean. Today we are talking big ideas about the Indian Ocean, the third largest ocean in the world, not the largest, only the third, but I dare to say that in terms of civilizational ideas that were circulating in all these different oceans, Indian Ocean emerged as the most significant because it is linked, it is connected to all the big civilizations of the world, the civilizations of Asia, the civilizations of the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the civilization of the Africa, and of course, talking about Southeast Asia, our own region, which is a waterway connecting two oceans between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. That is the position, the geographical position occupied by what used to be called the Malay Archipelago. The Malay Archipelago is sandwiched between the two oceans, but there's a lot to talk about that Indian Ocean. Basically, the Malay Archipelago, in a sense, facing the Indian Ocean through the Andaman Sea. Okay, I think let me go to the next. Yes. No, please go back. Objectives. Yeah. Objectives, please. All right. I just have a few slides, given 20 minutes presentation. So what I would like to impress upon you, what are the objectives of this conference? On the details, or more details about the big ideas that I want to talk about, we have speakers, a number of speakers, and then we will have a kind of Q&A session and open dialogue, this roundtable conference dialogue on this subject. So I would say that reading the theme of the conference, basically what you would like to achieve in the long term is to see the Indian Ocean, the very, very historic Indian Ocean, as a zone of peace. Incidentally, peace is Islam, the meaning of Islam. Peace is the universal meaning of Islam. Muslims cannot be indifferent to the pursuit of peace because it is the meaning of their own religion. And dialogue to create, and this was emphasized by our Prime Minister in his speech earlier. We watched that, he emphasized that when we talk about dialogue, and we relate to that to Islam, of course. He mentioned how the Prophet pursued dialogue with the view of coming up with multi-religious, multi-ethnic society in the city of Medina. I'll say later some more about the Madani content of this global dialogue. And then, of course, prosperity. So I have and this apology to Zopfan, usual Zopfan, zone of peace, freedom and neutrality. In November 1971, members of ASEAN at the time signed a declaration declaring our Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. What is one now? Slight variation of this. 54 years later, we are talking now. Yeah. 54 years later, leaders of the ASEAN were declaring the ASEAN as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. Now, given the new situation, the volatile situation in the Indian Ocean, the competition between China, India, the United States, and so on. So it's different situation. Please, no, AI is not a passion. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that is the ultimate, basically the overall objective. We together, right, little by little, we will look forward to work towards this as such an Indian Ocean, zone of peace, dialogue, and prosperity, Zobdan. Now, so underlying this pursuit of, for example, is of course the necessity for dialecticalism. And this I'm talking about this idea now. Yeah. So if you want to pursue that goal, objective, yeah, we have to talk about dialogue in a more serious way, in a clear way, not dialogue in just in the ordinary sense of the word, loosely used by many people. Dialogue it's become a word without any real meaning. But I'm using here dialogue in the original sense understood by Confucius in China, understood by Plato and Aristotle in Greece, and by the Prophet Muhammad in the city of Medina. That dialogue, of course, which in the Quran has many words. Of course, it's in the contemporary world. You have hiwar, yeah, and talk about dialogue, and hiwar, al-hadari, the civil dialogue. But also the word in dialogue as implied by the word Quranic word jadal. Yeah. Wajadilhum billati ahsan. Dialogue with them with a better argument, with better argumentation. So dialogue in that comprehensive sense, that's what I'm talking about here. Yeah. This dialogue both in words and in action. The dialogue that all the different parties, different groups in the Indian Ocean should, especially now, for example, between India and the Muslim countries bordering the Indian Ocean. All right. So I affirm my understanding of what we call this, the spirit. We need the spirit of dialecticalism. What do I mean by that? This definition is mine. So whether it is it's good or not, this is the one that I presented in my conversation with Professor Tu Wei Ming in a meeting in a dialogue of scholars of basically dialogue based in Beijing. So, dialecticalism is the belief that dialogue is the key to the discovery of truth, enhancement of mutual understanding and cooperation, empowerment of shared values, and global peace. That is the spirit that we want to pursue, that to cultivate. And of course, building a global, we want to build a global dialectical community and dialectical civilization based on the understanding of dialecticalism, shared values, cultivation of respect for differences, and celebrating unity in diversity. Okay, next, please. All right. Let me just, since I'm introducing the word now, dialecticalism, let's look at history, a brief, an overview. In China, according to Wei Ming, in his dialogue with Ikeda of the Sokagaka International, which means that Confucius founded the first dialogical community in the world. If you understand by dialogue, in a sense, yeah. If I explain here, for example, the dialogue here, we can have a dialogical education, for example. It's how truth has been spread, has been transmitted, not through a one basically one way, but it's rather the prophet or the spiritual leader or the founder of the Zheng will present, of course, present questions to his disciples, and then disciples will answer, and then the spiritual leader will answer again. So in other words, the idea that a particular person understands something based on this kind of dialogue between two different individuals. Also in Greece, you have Plato and Aristotle founded the first dialectical society in the West. Only, I think, not long after what in China, maybe 3 decades, 4 decades, then after Confucius, then you have Plato, who wrote the first dialogue, to understand the spirit of that dialogue. Yeah. In Islam, of course, the Prophet Muhammad founded the first dialectical community in Islam in Medina. So basically, I would say that what happened in Medina, the city of Medina, was precisely how the Prophet through this dialectical community wants to establish Islam, and of course to found a new community of what they call this of cosmopolitanism. In other words, precisely the idea that we all belong to one single community. And then in Muslim Spain, the dialectical community of Muslim, Jews, and Christian. In Mughal India, the dialectical community of Hindus and Muslims. And in Ming China, dialectical community of Confucianists and Muslims, especially during the period of Liu Ji in the 17th century. Okay, next one. So basically, I would say when we are looking at our situation now, we can observe that there is increasing dialogue advocacy, initiatives, programs, institutions, and literature. So there's no doubt about that we are moving ahead. If you compare to the situation 30 years ago, when we had the Islam and Confucianism conference in the University of Malaya. I want to quote here the view of Tu Weiming here regarding his belief about the current situation. He said, I strongly believe a dialectical civilization is emerging. The cultivation of a wholesome dialectical civilization is the right path towards a culture of peace for the global village. And of course, I will add my own view, my own basically overview of the current situation. Muslim dialectical experiences provide precedent for contemporary Muslims to further enhance the universal ideals of the dialectical community. I'm saying this because I realize that there are many Muslims who still do not embrace the idea of dialogue. Some even going to extend that dialogue is not in conformity with the teachings of Islam. Okay, next one, please. Yes, I just have that one right there. How to empower dialecticalism and the dialogical community. I just want to talk about the role of IIM. I think IIM can play an instrumental role in the realization of the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace, as a zone of peace, dialogue, and prosperity. I just want to share what we are doing at the university in front of many of our friends and colleagues from outside the university. Certainly, we have taken initiative to establish a number of outfits about institutes and center, which can have a very important role. For example, Dr. Zia Zaruddin is here in the hall. He has been appointed as the director of the new Institute of the Institute of Future Studies, as announced by the Prime Minister sometime back. Well, of course, you want to talk about the future of the Indian Ocean. What will be the future of the Indian Ocean a decade from now? 3 decades from now. So I would say that that should be part of the concern of that institute. So the Prime Minister emphasized that this morning. Yeah? And then we have the Institute of Internationalization and ASEAN Studies. Okay. I mentioned Professor Farr. He's going to talk also about that later. Now, that's important. This new thing, in other words, want to promote the studies, internationalization studies, international relations, and perhaps also the Indian Ocean would be one important part of the role of that outfit, inshallah. And then I would certainly I would like to see some of the departments in the university following up on this conference. We have, for example, the Department of Political Science and Madani Studies, the renamed department, which will have to talk about the issues that have been raised by the Prime Minister and raised by that I've just mentioned. And then we have a new center of renamed Center of Peace, Dialogue, and Xenophobia, because we are not using the word Islamophobia. We want to include a more embracing word. But the point is, whatever we study about the xenophobia will be in the broader context of the pursuit of peace and dialogue, as indicated by the theme of this conference. Yeah, and the idea of Department of basically re-energizing the Department of Usuluddin and Comparative Religion and Philosophy, which will be important, the pursuit of dialogue. And of course, our ISTAC, that have always played that role, the ISTAC playing the role in the field of Islamic thought and civilization, and so on. Just to share that with you. In other words, this conference, the theme of the conference, is very much in accord with what we are currently pursuing in the university. Okay, the next one, basically, okay, my concluding remarks. I wish to affirm the view that the future of global peace lies in the pursuit of dialogicalism as a social doctrine and the practical ideal of the dialogical community empowered by faith in divine wisdom. So basically, my introductory remarks before the real discussion. I just want to raise several issues. So thank you very much, and I want to thank the organizers, the co-organizers, the Zheng Forum, and the IIM, especially through our friends in the Kuliah of Reveal Knowledge and a few of its departments, and of course to everyone. Thank you for attending. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you to you, Dr. Usman, for the insightful reflections. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now privileged to have with us, though not virtually, but through speakerphone due to some technical issues, Professor Emeritus Dr. John Vall from Georgetown University, USA. John O. Vall is Professor Emeritus of Islamic History and past Associate Director of the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He graduated from Dartmouth College and received his MA in Middle Eastern Studies and PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. Before joining Georgetown, he taught Middle Eastern and world history for 30 years at the University of New Hampshire. Professor Vall is a specialist in modern Islamic history and the author of Islam, Continuity and Change in the Modern World, co-editor of Asian Islam in the 21st century, and co-author of Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring. In total, he has authored, co-authored, and edited more than 10 books in addition to numerous scholarly articles. He is a past president of the Middle East Students Association and the New England Historical Association and has served on boards of several academic and cultural institutions. Professor Vall has lived in Sudan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine, and he has conducted research on Islamic movements across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. This morning, he will be presenting on Beyond Civilizations, Makers of Cosmopolitanism in the Indian Ocean. We will assist him in managing his slides during the presentation. I think we just cannot see his face. All right.
Discussion. The thing I want us to concentrate on for a few minutes is how the Indian Ocean operated within the framework of cosmopolitan networks and civilizational organization. I think that what we do is we look at, I'm sorry I didn't hear Professor Osman's discussion because it was what I was hoping I would start with in a way. We are looking at how different groups of people interact and communicate with each other. In terms of history, most people we tend to think in terms of civilizations, big civilizations and tribal societies, and sort of groups and peoples. And in that discussion, the emphasis is usually given to civilization. And so I want us to think in terms, what I've got is the title that I told Hayun would be Beyond Civilization, Makers of Cosmopolitanism in the Indian Ocean Area. The story and narrative of world history tends often to be told in terms of battles among civilizations, and in recent years, in talking about contemporary global affairs, especially as they relate to Islam in the West, people talk about the clash of civilizations. But as we look at an area like the Indian Ocean, it is possible to see that the groupings of people that are called civilizations get together not just in wars and killing each other, but also in terms of cooperation, coordination, and productive networks in scholarship, religion, and economics, and so on. So as we look at this, it's interesting to look at an essay, the foreword that now Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim wrote for the book on Islam and Confucianism, edited by Professor Osman. And in that, he looked at the, he says that Prime Minister Anwar says, history has long presented the past as peopled by discrete and distinct civilizations, cultures, and societies, and contact between civilizations was essentially a matter of preservation of political, cultural territory and integrity. And then little wonder then that the history is the history of conflict. But as Prime Minister Anwar has been talking for now many years, it is important also to recognize that there are positive interactions among civilizations. And so that a question that I wanted to just raise was then how does the interactions among civilizations get shaped in the Indian Ocean area? And it's interesting to me to see the major names in the history of the Indian Ocean are names of people who are not identified with specifically only with a single civilization, but rather are identified with the interaction of people across continents and across and among civilizations. And so as we think about the question of how can there be, in the title of the conversation, cosmopolitanism and collaboration across civilizations in the Indian Ocean. There are people who have worked to build networks of relationships across boundaries, rather than civilizations being defined as harsh, strong boundaries that people they try to defend and get involved in wars and clashes. There is also collaboration, and you create then a cosmopolitan, multi-civilizational kind of life and work. And there's interesting people in the history of the Indian Ocean that work this way. If we look way back, the first slide in the PowerPoint that I had is a map of the travels of Ibn Battuta. And already in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, people could go from all the way of North Africa and West Africa to Southeast Asia and Asia. And we see this with Ibn Battuta. And as we look then at the idea of collaboration across civilizations, somebody like Ibn Battuta represents a collaboration of friendship and scholarship. Then Zheng, the major name in the conference that Professor Hayun works with and so on, becomes an important figure as well, because he shows the way that already by the 14th and 15th century, the Indian Ocean was an area with many different groups of people going together and creating then a new kind of society and a new kind of specialization. So as we look then at these, there are hundreds of people that are active within the whole body of the Indian Ocean basin. I've done a little bit of a study of sort of the people who are labeled as being El Hindi or as Sindhi by the 18th century biography collection by Muhammad Khalil Muradi. And there are 7 or 8 of these people who he mentions as being important sort of figures. Somebody who is Hindi, like Abdul al-Hindi, who died in 1730, was somebody who was born in Kabul, who studied in Samarkand and in India, and eventually ended up in Damascus as a local religious leader. And he was not treated as a foreigner. He was treated, and he became a part. He became a cosmopolitan citizen, a cosmopolitan person of Damascus. And I think that we have many people who are cosmopolitan and enable collaboration among civilizations by their cosmopolitanism. And this emphasizes the fact that the cultural boundary lines between civilizations are not as rigid as the people who say that there's always going to be a clash of civilizations. And I think probably one of the nicest symbols are, for example, in architecture. And I think it's not the next slide, but the next slide after that, near the end, the mosque endemic, which is a medieval mosque which has characteristic typical Southeast Asian architecture, but a Islamic content to it, and it becomes then a symbol not of clash of civilizations, but of synthesis of civilizations as people create art and culture and learning. And I think that as we get into the modern period, there are also many examples, but rather than keeping you now, I will finish by saying that this whole idea of cosmopolitan collaboration, creating new cultural awakening, can be seen in a number of ways in the 21st century. And something that I've done a little bit of work on is the musical expression of a cultural syncretism that represents a cooperation rather than a clash of civilizations, and that is the spread of heavy metal music and hip hop. And one of my favorite groups in that is an Indonesian group called the Voice of Pasiplak, which is a group of three younger women who are very modern, very activist in terms of political issues and things like that, but are very well known as hip hop and heavy metal people, but are also hijabi. And the hijabi hip hop is a kind of interesting symbol, not of how one culture has borrowed from another, but how two cultures have worked together to create a new kind of thing. So I will finish. I told Professor Hayun that I wouldn't talk for more than 10 minutes. I think I've already talked more than that. But it's been a real pleasure to talk. For scholars, one of the real important is for scholars as they look at civilizations interacting and learn from the Indian Ocean experiences of people like Ibn Battuta and Voice of Basiplak, that civilizations can work together and that the boundary lines between civilizations are not rigid, but rather can create new ways of coping with human issues and of having social organization. Well, I'm sorry I can't see you, but I hope you have a great continuing conversation. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor John Voll. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to our panel presentations, which will explore the themes of diplomacy, trade, economic cooperation, and regional partnerships in the Indian Ocean. To guide us through this important segment, I now pass the session over to our panel moderator, Professor Imtiaz.
I just want to say here Professor Imtiaz is currently. Can I use? Yeah. Okay. No, Professor Imtiaz is currently Professor of Dialogical Studies at IIM.
I can use that one. Yeah. Good. That's better. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you very much to Professor Dato Usman Baka, the rector of International Islamic University, who invited me to come back to IIUM and ISTEC after 1.5 years after I left the university at the end of my contract. And as he said, I'm going to talk about moderate this session. I'm not going to speaker. There are 3 speakers. But before I go to them, I thought I would give you some background about this conference and to put it into context so that we can have a good interactive discussion. I heard Professor Usman talking a lot about Indian Ocean. I am from the Indian Ocean. I'm a child of the Indian Ocean. I'm a child. Because I have a very complicated background. Something like Zheng, a nomadic person roaming around the world, and still at this age, I'm still roaming around the world. When I get up in the morning, I ask my wife, where am I? Am I in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Tanzania, in UK? So it's really very jumbled up. I was born in Tanzania, in East Africa. So my globalization was of languages, cultures, and religions, which is very important to what we are talking about, dialogical studies and Zheng. And then I went at the age of 13, I went to study in India. I did my BA, my high school, my BA, my master's over there. Because I want to say this to you because to put myself in background to understand what is all going about. Then I went to US to do my PhD. But going back to Indian Ocean, I'm the child of the colony. I'm a British citizen because Tanzania was British colony. So until today, I carry a British citizenship. Then I was in Thailand for 30 years after US. I was in Malaysia for 4 years. And then Vietnam, 1.5 years, back to Malaysia. I speak 6 languages. So I'm a child of Indian Ocean and many other oceans at the same time. So this is where I come from, very complicated. Having said that, I speak 6 languages, English, Swahili, Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, and Thai. If you ask, I was in England recently, and people asked me, what is your mother tongue? I said, I dream in English. So child of this colonization. Well, we have a very interesting discussion here today about cosmopolitanism. But my globalization, as I said, is not a Pepsi-Cola globalization. And Professor Ma Hayun knows that when we are talking about Zheng He and China and the civilizations that Professor Usman mentioned about, they were not Pepsi-Cola globalization. They were not pizza globalization. They were globalizations of a different character, of a different nature. So, having said that, I want to give a brief background before I introduce the speakers. This is the program. So this is Zheng He. These are portraits from traditional Chinese painting and from Wikipedia. Like he's presented as a hero. Now, having said that, these are the routes where he traveled in his 7 voyages. So you can see he's starting from Nanjing. Of course, he was from Kunming. I've been to Kunming several times, and to Ningxia and other parts of China. So he has been all over. If we start from China to Southeast Asia, to Surabaya, to Semarang, and back up to Ayutthaya, and then go to Calicut. He dies in Calicut in India, in Kerala, then to Aden, and then to East Africa, which is Malindi. Malindi is in Tanzania. So that is my relationship where he comes from. And also Mogadishu and Mombasa. So he has a Muslim heritage. His family belonged to the Hui Muslims. As you very well know, there are two ethnic groups in China, the Hui and the Han. And he's regarded as the admiral in Chinese history, and his name is Ma He. Ma Yun is here. Later adopted the surname of Zheng. Now, very interesting here, admiral. The term admiral in English is basically taken from Arabic, Amir al-Bahr. That is the root of admiral. So that is an imported word into English language. Amir al-Bahr, it becomes admiral. So you can understand how the civilizational background comes in. In the Ming Dynasty, which was after the Yuan Dynasty, and between 1405 to 1433, he made 7 large-scale voyages around the world. So what was the purpose? His purpose was diplomacy, and for the Ming Dynasty and tributary system, showing the power of China and show of force, which all invasions did, which all interventions did. If you see at the history of invasion of civilizations, sometimes, like I study on Islam and Buddhism, and they say, Muslims destroyed Buddhism in India. That is not the story. That's not how we look at it. But basically, it is how power rotates and how power gets engaged in world history. Okay. Now, coming to East Africa is very important for me because his 5th, 6th, and 7th voyages took him to East Africa, Malindi, Mombasa, on the East African coast. And when I was in primary school, we were taught, primary school, in Tanzania, very poor country, we were taught about the bone dishes and the pottery, Chinese pottery, which was found in Kilwa. So that talks about the history of East Africa's relations with China. And Zheng He, when he went back to China, he took exotic animals like lions, leopards, ostriches, zebras, and giraffes to show them to the emperor. So here is an example. If you are familiar with his history and his travel, is a giraffe being taken to China. There's a very interesting book, if you are further interested in looking at it, Zheng He's Voyages to Africa. I'm mentioning Africa because here we are in Southeast Asia. So, Africa is important for me, historically, biographically speaking, as well as in relation to Zheng He, from China to Southeast Asia to Africa. Now, there is a very interesting article in South China Morning Post, which talks about his descendants of Chinese Admiral Zheng He, who lived in Mombasa. And they say we were pretty sure there were Chinese, the Kenyans, who believe they are descended from the shipwrecked sailors of 15th century Admiral Zheng He's fleet. So you can go and look at this article. This lady looks like an African, but she has her features are not totally dark, but you see a yellowish color in there. Now, for me, again, China is very important because coming from Tanzania in post-colonial period, China had a very good relations with Tanzania, with President Julius Nyerere and Mao Zedong. So since childhood, this is there in my mind, though I'm not a communist or a socialist, but this is part of my bringing. Now, very interesting is the visit of Zhou Enlai to Tanzania, and this is historical for me. In 1965, when he came to Tanzania, I was a primary school boy. I think about 10 years or something like that, and we were waving the flags, you know, Chao Enlai Nyerere, Chao Enlai Nyerere. So I need to say this and show you, because Tanzania has always had good relations with China, and until today we have. This is, sorry, same picture. Oh, sorry, I'm going the other way. And so we have 65 years relations with China, and which continue until today. My last slide here before I go to the speakers is that China has always stood with Tanzania. Now, since we are talking about Gaza, it is important that China supported Tanzania as a frontline state against apartheid in South Africa, which is as important as apartheid in Israel. So you can understand that part of it. And in 1971, it was Tanzania, Ambassador Majid, it was Tanzania which played a very important role in restoring the Chinese position, a seat in the United Nations, and on the and to become the permanent member of the Security Council. I have to say this in background just to put everything in context. Now, I'll close my slide here and go to the speakers. Now, we have three important speakers, presenters here. According to the program, forgot what is the order. So we have Professor Dr. Mahayun Ma, and then will be followed by Dr. Abdul Majid Ahmad Khan, and the last, not the last, for this session, speaker will be Dr. Far Kim Bang from ISTEC IIUM. I will introduce them one by one, so then we can get into context. So Professor Mahayun, I know him for several years since I was in Thailand, is an associate professor at Forsberg State University Department of History, and also the president of Zheng Forum that focuses on China, Muslim, world relations. And most of his work is on the history of Islam in China. I don't know which part of China he is from. I'll let him speak about it when he presents it. And his articles and reviews and opinions have appeared in important journals like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Late Imperial China, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, and so on. So, Professor Mahayun, please go ahead and make your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Before I present my one point here, I want to talk about 2 points. One is why dialogue. And of course, we have a lot of reasons to justify dialogue. But primarily, I think we have 2 reasons. One reason is Professor Osman mentioned Tawhid. And if you study, anthropology, if you study archaeology, of course, even today, scientists have reached a consensus. Human beings, we shared ancestors from somewhere in Africa. I don't know if Tanzania or Kenya, somewhere must be. And of course, we have to dialogue. That's the reason Quran told us God created all these people with different language in order to let us to know each other. That's the dialogue. Second, I think the reason why we need to dialogue is not only because we share one humanity, but also if you look at all peoples, all religions, if you study anthropology again, you will find all human beings have shared common, even same institutions. For example, marriage. That's why I think there is an internal drive or internal force for us to dialogue. The third one is we look at it today. If you look at it from Africa to Europe, transatlantic to Indian Ocean, many of the regions have been bothered by all this plague, wars, conflict. So that's, of course, to solve all this problem, we need to have a dialogue. So that's the reason. But here I want to go to second question, why Indian Ocean? It's really direct. When you look at transatlantic ocean today, when you say Euro-America supported Israeli genocide of Palestine, that's basically about Atlantic Ocean. If you look at the Ukrainian-Russian war, it's about NATO, Russian or former Soviet, Warsaw Pact, still transatlantic politics. Then when you look at United States bullying against the neighbors, right? It's also a totally North American transatlantic issue. But the Indian Ocean region, I would say, relatively speaking, so far, so peaceful. And of course, as Professor Osman just mentioned, we have great civilizations from Africa, Middle East, India to China. So that's why I think that's fundamental reasons why I need to have this dialogue, especially in Indian region. We not only have all these traditions, but even today we see all this contemporary peaceful coexistence. And my presentation here actually look more deeper into not simply communication, not simply just a partnership, but actually I want to talk about combination of civilizations. I think Professor Vo just mentioned it's really hard to divide human beings into concrete so-called civilization. You cannot. For example, Zheng He is a Chinese, his Muslim family background, identify him as what we call the Chinese civilization bear, or practitioner of Islamic civilization. So I think it's really hard. So that's why today I want to look at one of the very famous Muslim cemetery in Quanzhou, the very famous Lingshan Muslim cemetery. And you can see from here the map, the city, the location. And interesting enough, possible around 12th to 13th century, we can see Chinese scholars, port officials, they began to document this is a Muslim cemetery. And you can look at the code here. They say, well, this is the, a cemetery built by a foreign merchant, a guy called Shnawi Dash person. What does Dash mean? Of course, if you study Islam of China, if you study even Southeast Asian Islam in early history, Dashi or what Dachi refer to Muslims. Even today, I think that's a common, consensus among all scholars. If you work on China, Chinese Islam and Muslim. So here you see, we found a Muslim cemetery. But the truth is, this is not simply a Muslim cemetery. Can you, Dr. Adili, next please? If you go back 1 century earlier, one find actually, according to Chinese sources, this cemetery was built by Southeast Asians. Exactly speaking by Sanfuqi or Srivijaya. How to say that's basically Malay Peninsula. Somebody here, if you look at by this guy Lin Zhiqi, in early 12th and late 12th century. He basically said there are scores of rich merchants from Sanfuqi, which means Srivijaya, are living or were born in Quanzhou. Among them is the man called Shnawi here. She is famous for his generosity among his fellow foreign residents in Quanzhou. The beauty of cemetery is but one of his many generous deeds. So here what we see, this is not about Muslim. This is built by Southeast Asians, our Srivijaya people, or merchants. And also interesting enough, almost simultaneously, or even a little bit early, if you see here, the second quote, mid-11th century, a Chinese painter, actually, if you go to Princeton University, they still host all these paintings. They even explain, in this country, Srivijaya, or in Chinese, it's called Sanfuqi, people have a lot of surnames, like Pu. Here we have big problem for scholars of Islamic study. Because so far, most scholars in study of Chinese Islam, they interpreted Bu as Abu. This is a Muslim name. They interpreted some name found in Sanfuqi, this Ali, for example, they translated as Ali. They basically try to Islamicize all these names. But if you look at 11th century Chinese painters, they explained the country of Sanfuqi is located in south of the sea and is the capital hub of maritime transportation. The people living close to water and they used wood to make all coupled with barges. That's why they took barges Pu as surname. So we see this is not about Islam. This is not about Arabs. It's not about Ali. This is not about Abu. This is totally about Srivijaya or Sanfuqi in today's Malay Peninsula. And the interesting thing is, as I mentioned, the Chinese terminology for Muslims and Arabs from Tang Dynasty is a Dashi, I just mentioned in my beginning. But here, even in pre-Islamic era, we find this term actually appeared referring to Southeast Asians. For example, you have this Zheng scholar back to 5th century. He's from Southern Liang Dynasty, basically governing today's southern China. He basically depicted a country called Dashi. He said, in the Dashi kingdom located in the West Sea, there is a square-shaped stone upon which grew many trees. These trees have red leaves and green branches, and from their branches grew little children. So Southeast Asian produce children from tree. This is really funny description or imagination of a country or people somewhere in the sea in Southeast Asia. But this description, interesting enough, from 8th century began to incorporate it into Chinese historiography of Muslim and Islam. I just quote one piece here from Tongdian Du Yu in 8th century. He initially talked about Islam and Muslim by quoting his nephew. If you see the third one here from Jing Xinji, they really talk about Arabs and Muslims. They said there is also called Yajuru, an early transliteration of Ajura or Ajil, likely referred to Arabian. The king of the Dashi bear the title Mu'min, of course, that's the transliteration. And he reciting especially that people and women are tall, and this description. In the second paragraph, when you look at the red, highlighted in red, he actually incorporated this Southeast Asian story to talk about Arabs and Muslims. So now we begin to have a story say Arabs began to produce children from tree somewhere in West Sea. So that's why you can see even before Islamic era, we really have all these Dashi people from Southeast Asia, then combined with later Arab and Muslims. So that's why from 8th century all the way to Yuan Dynasty, all Chinese historiographers, when they talk about Islam and the Muslim, half of the content or descriptions are actually about Southeast Asia. A country called Dashi, and actually if you are familiar with Southeast Asia, that's basically taxi. People even identify a country possibly near today Singapore, so that's the taxi. And of course, back to 10th century, 11th century, you have a lot of taxi country in Southeast Asia, or simply we can call island country, water country. So that's the use of Dashi, refer to Southeast Asians and Arabs. Brother, can you go next one? So in Chinese historiography, you can see here, from 8th century to 9th century, we have two Dashi. One is referred to Arabs. The other one is referred to Southeast Asians, especially in the second part, you can see from 10th century, mid-10th century, you really have a country from Southeast Asia, the country of Dashi. They dispatch envoys. They present some Buddhist present to Chinese emperor. You have all this interaction, and people say, well, if Arab Empire existed already from 7th century or 8th century, why you have a 10th century, the first encounter between Chinese and the so-called Dashi country from Southeast Asia? So here it's very clear there is a kingdom began to establish diplomatic relationship with China around 961. So this is totally different country, but the Chinese use the same term, refer to this country. Interesting enough, when you look at how Chinese describe this country in Southeast Asia, it said the kingdom of Champa is located to the southwest of China. The clothing and the custom of this kingdom are generally similar to those of Dashi. Of course, Champa, Vietnamese, they don't have the similar custom or clothes with Arabs or Muslims. So basically, they talk about this Dashi located somewhere in Southeast Asia, all the way to 10th century, 11th century. Finally, by 14th century, during the Mongol time, the Arab Dashi began to disappear. You cannot find any historical records on Dashi since the Mongol time. You began to have a Huihui, referred to Muslims. And the exotic Dashi, as far as I can see, basically in this Yi Zhi, in the Yuan Dynasty, we cannot identify the exact date of this text, but they really discuss this really bizarre practice of this Dashi people. You can see they even talk about the costumes. It really cannot describe, but you can see Dashi is a mythology. It's not really a concrete political entity by the Yuan Dynasty. So now back to the tomb I presented in the first in the point. The Muslim tomb. as I said, initially built by Southeast Asians, but later on became Muslim cemetery. So the reason is why. And Chinese scholars actually presented several concrete evidence. The first one is Yue Ke. In 12th century, he is the grandson of Chinese hero Yue Fei. He basically visited Guangzhou, he visited Southeast Asia, especially Sri Vijaya Temple, cemetery. He found all these merchants, the diaspora began to decline. Not only in Guangzhou, but also in Quanzhou. Why? Of course, if you study Southeast Asia, you know, at this time, you have very powerful Chula invasion of Sri Vijaya. You have a powerful Khmer invasion expansion from today's Cambodian to Champa to South, Malay Peninsula. You also have Ayutthaya Thai expansion. So that's why basically at this time, Southeast Asians began to disappear. The community began to disappear. And the Muslims began to rise in Quanzhou, especially according to a Yuan source here. You can see from 11th century, they talk about while Muslims began to build the cemetery I just mentioned. And actually here you can see Muslims did not build a cemetery, but maintained the cemetery. And of course, during the Mongol time, the major foreign communities in China are Muslims from Central Asia. So that's why, interesting enough, Muslims now began to maintain the Southeast Asian Sri Vijaya tomb, and they began to convert as a Muslim holy site. Now, last question, why holy? Well, when you talk about holy, it must be related to someone important. During the Mongol time, if you look at even Batuta, if you look at other travelers, they talk a lot about a mountain in today's Champa, which is called the Linga. Linga is Hindu Buddhist term. And later on, even Ibn Batuta, they described how dangerous it is when you're passing by this mountain, because they called there's a Luch. What does Luch mean? Westerners, even by I think the Gama era, they said, oh, from East Africa to Arabia to Sri Lanka, you have a Luch. They interpret the Luch as a huge bird. They can carry an elephant, that kind of imagination. But even Batuta, Zheng, all these people, if you navigate, you have to pass in by Champa. You have to pass in by this Linga mountain. So that's from the Yuan dynasty to the Ming dynasty, when Muslims in China began to use this tomb or the cemetery to bury important people, especially Sahaba in the Yuan dynasty. Some people Muslims died and buried in the cemetery. They claim to be Sahaba. Then, of course, the Chinese began to document this is the Luch mountain, a mountain of Luch, because you buried important Muslim figures. So that's why, especially when Zheng He began to navigate, he actually went to this mountain to pray for all these Luch of saint. So a lot of scholars try to understand why Zheng He went to this Linshan mountain to pray. Some people say, well, of course, he's a Muslim, this is a Muslim cemetery too. You just, went to cemetery to pray, that's fine. But why especially Linshan, our Luch of mountain? You have concrete reason from the Mongol time to Ming dynasty. As long as you travel, as long as you navigate to Southeast Asia, as long as you're passing by Linga mountain in Champa area, you have to pray, especially in this cemetery, because that not only represent Muslim Luch, but also it's related to early pre-Islamic Luch mountain in today's Champa. So here we see the total combination of civilizations, not simply Islamic or Buddhist. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahayun. You gave us an important information about the cross-cultural interaction between ancient China and Southeast Asia, and especially the mention of Champa and the importance of visiting Muslims who are in this part of the world. You really highlighted the story of the Dashi, and the Dashi is the Southeast Asian, and also relations with the identification with the Arabs. I'm going to the second speaker, and he is Dato Abdul Majid bin Ahmad Khan, a former Malaysian diplomat who joined the Malaysian Diplomatic Administrative Service in 1970, and has been in that service, was in that service for 34 years. He served at many Malaysian missions abroad and in senior positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He served as a diplomat in the United States, Laos, Vietnam, China, and for a long time in China. He served there as twice as the ambassador of Malaysia to the People's Republic of China in 1999, when he was there for 7 years until his retirement in 2005. Since his retirement, he continues to promote people-to-people diplomacy between Malaysia and China, and he is involved in corporate world and also in economic development, as well as ASEAN geopolitical issues. His current position is that he's the president of Malaysia-China Friendship Association, honorary chairman of Malaysia-China Chamber of Commerce, board member of Board of Governors of IIUM, Board of Governors, Emeritus University Malaysia, adjunct professor at the Institute of China Studies at or University of Malaya, advisor to Dongguan People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, and also the co-founder of Zheng International Peace Foundation. So it's very relevant, his background and his biography is very relevant to our presentation here. After he has 34 years of service in the government of Malaysia and served in the Prime Minister's office, also as I mentioned, in the Malaysian missions abroad. It's a long CV. I'm not going to go to read all of that. So please, Dato Majid.
Thank you, Professor Ines, for the kind remark. Assalamualaikum, Professor Dr. Osman Bakar, and distinguished participants. I'm very happy actually to be a participant at this forum this morning for two reasons. Basically, the organizers have organized a very powerful team, Madani, Admiral Legacy, and also civilization dialogue among countries as a part towards a peaceful coexistence, and also most importantly to bring about stability, prosperity to the people of the region. And here we are talking about the Indian Ocean. I've been associated with Zheng Forum, which has the same objective based on Admiral Zheng's legacy, which we actually wish to take on the peaceful purpose of the mission. There are several other views about it. As we've seen, all this actually have contributed to the prosperity and peace of the Indian Ocean. In fact, our Prime Minister and other speakers have actually come up to a conclusion that cross-civilization, cross-border civilization, trade and economic are factors that brought about the world that we are today, relatively peaceful, but of course, we are also facing a very rough times ahead. And this way, I think this forum is important. And I think all the speakers have agreed that cross-civilization dialogue, what Professor Osman mentioned, dialogical civilization is the way forward. But we put quite a strong emphasis on the Islamic aspects of it based on Tawhid and divine wisdom. So I hope that happy that Zheng Forum is back in Malaysia. We started it actually about 12 years ago. We had the first meeting in Dubai. Then we follow up in Bandung, Jakarta. We went to Pakistan. We went to Kazakhstan. And with the strong support of Professor Osman, we are back here. And hopefully, we like to have the Zheng Forum located in Malaysia, which is nearer the Indian Ocean. Yeah. So I think all the speakers have mentioned at length on the importance of the Indian Ocean contribution to historical, cultural aspects of the cooperation. I think we all agree, we have seen this ourselves. And that's one reason why our Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, with strong support of Professor Osman, has come up with this Madani civilization. Malaysia is quite new to the game in terms of the concept. Actually, through Madani, they would like to actually come out with a civilizational aspect of development.
which is an ongoing, is work in progress. But I think we all believe this is the way for future prosperity and cooperation, since Malaysia is a multiracial and we are part of the globalized world, interconnected with diverse characteristics. I think we have come up to that conclusion, and this is also the majority of most of the people going towards cooperation, prosperity. So this forum, with the powerful speeches that were given by the speakers, I hope it form the foundation for our further contribution, for further intellectual input. I know many of these people present here have this very strong background. They also have been personally involved in their past career and activities along this line. So perhaps as we move forward, as a result of today's forum, we could come up with some sort of contribution towards consolidating this concept, this dialogical civilization that we all trying to evolve or build. So I will then touch basically on the subject that has been given to me on Indian Ocean Economic Cooperation. I will not actually deal in depth because I think all of us knows about the importance of the Indian Ocean. It was and remains to be a very important trade artery connecting all the important centers. It has given rise to empires in the past. Professor Ma mentioned about Srivijaya and the contact, and also the establishment of centers like Java, then Maritime, and in India, Gupta, and later on, in the modern sense, we have the rise of Bombay, Mombasa, then also cities in Tanzania, all played a role, and this has been a positive role. So I think then the linkage, apart from the main linkage, has been trade and will continue to be. And I think in the recent years, this linkage, economic continuity, has gained more prominence for basically 2 or 3 reasons. First, the discovery of petroleum, oil reserve, and gas around the region that has actually made it an important, source of these resources. And what more, all these resources need to be transported to the consumer in east of the, as well as the west of the Indian Ocean, which make the Indian Ocean trade route strategic and very important to most countries which are dependent on import and export delivery. Secondly, Indian Ocean is also known, rich in fishery resources, and under the seabed, mining and other minerals. This become very strategic to many countries. And thirdly, in recent years, a lot of investment have gone through coastal cities and areas, result in development of tourism facilities. That has also become another source of revenue of many countries and also important connectivity for economic development among the people of the region. So I think as we move forward, how do we actually work out a framework to sustain this positive collaboration that we have seen? I think this is something that this forum should look into. As you have seen recent years, countries like India, China, United States, the major powers have actually expressed interest because of the economic importance, because of the maritime security, but also because of some environmental factors. Countries like China, India, and United States have come out with their own respective framework of cooperation based on economic as well as security. Most of these frameworks that has actually emerged in recent years has both geopolitical and geoeconomic consideration. It also reflects the current state of rivalries between powers for global, dominance, or to revitalize their global dominance, given the transition that we see today taking place in the global landscape. So I think in this case, for Malaysia, we have welcomed all this initiative. Basically, we are not aligned to any geostrategic interests, but what we want is stronger economic collaboration that creates prosperity to the people, that then enrich our civilizational and also cultural life. And we have actually adjusted our position. For example, on Chinese BRI, we see some strong merits in the proposal, and Malaysia has been one of the early supporter of the project, and we have benefited. We think, and it has shown that BRI, despite having its own geopolitical and geo-economic objective, has actually contributed positively in terms of increased connectivity, trade, promotion of tourism, and that also create understanding, which is also the objective of many of us working through parent institution. And also, we have looked positively on the Indo-Pacific proposal as far as it relates to economic benefit that we can derive from such proposal. Because we have shied away from any gathering or alliances that connotes any geopolitical objective against another country. But if it's an economic, we can always justify. We will embrace all these platforms because Malaysia, being a trading country, needs all the economic platform actually to increase our prosperity, especially at this time. And also, we want to be a part of efforts now to drive the world towards greater cooperation, greater collaboration rather than confrontation. As you are aware today, the world is totally divided along ideological lines, basically of big power competition. And also we have to realize Indian Ocean region, if not carefully managed with innovative framework of cooperation and also with a beneficial approach to all those involved, could be disrupted. As it is now, the Trump administration view on the role of tariff could be a destructive force. But hopefully it could also be a positive force if finally it could bring mutual prosperity for all. This is something we have to see, but I think it's something that Malaysia and forum like this should play an important role, at least on the intellectual input and to support our policy makers. I'm happy to hear from Professor Osman that IIUM will now take a more active role to look into the studies, the ASEAN studies, Indian Ocean study, and we are invited back, Professor Temas, to come back on the ideological civilization to push through. But also, as we are aware, Malaysian public is really not very well versed with this type of thoughts that we are trying to push. So perhaps more work needs to be done. And I think all the institutions around here, including Zheng Forum, IUM, and many other institutions, and also individuals, should come forward that will continue to sustain the role of the Indian Ocean as, what we mentioned, as a zone of peace, prosperity, and also connectivity to continue to sustain the connection of old, ancient, established civilization and the great religion, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity as a foundation of prosperity and understanding. With that, I close my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Majid Ahmad Khan. You gave us a very interesting diplomatic insight into what is going on in the region, and also touched upon the geopolitical and the geocultural as well as geopolitical. I'm using the word geocultural before geopolitical discourse and exchanges in the Indian Ocean. You highlighted the importance, the richness of the Indian Ocean zone, and the positive gains we can make from this region. I lived in Thailand for 30 years. means I lived in ASEAN for 30 years, and I've come to a conclusion that this is the most politically stable, economically vibrant region of the world. And one another very important aspect of ASEAN region is this: is that it is special about Malaysia. Yeah, this was the point I want to make. For me, when I look at the Muslim world, Malaysia is the most developed countries in the Muslim world. I hope Professor Aslam agrees with me on that. More than Turkey, in terms of economic development, in terms of industrial development, Malaysia is far ahead compared to all other Muslim countries. I just came back from Canada, US, UK, and whenever Malaysia is mentioned, the faces of the Muslims brighten up, and everyone wants to come to Malaysia. And you understand what I mean. If I go to Pakistan, everybody wants to come to Malaysia, but that's the other issue. So Malaysia has a positive contribution to make to this whole discourse of civilizational dialogue. And you also mentioned about the tariff wars. So that takes me to the next speaker, who has a very important article published recently titled Tariff Wars on ASEAN, Trump's Tariffs on ASEAN. And the next speaker here is Professor Far Kim Bang, whom also I know for several decades. He is the professor of ASEAN Studies at the International Islamic University of Malaysia and was formerly a head of teaching fellow of Harvard with multiple teaching awards. He was former director of political and security community in ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta and remains a columnist to the Jakarta Post and occasionally to Nikkei and ASEAN Review, South China Morning Post. He is also a senior fellow at the Asia Europe Institute, AEI, in University of Malaya. So Professor Far Kim Bang, welcome.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. The problem of being the last speaker, I assume I'm the last speaker, is that all the good things have been said before me, and I have nothing much left to comment on. However, that being said, I'll do my level best to try to enlighten and illuminate what is most relevant to Zheng Forum. I think Zheng Forum or Zheng, his legacy can be considered as a form of historical reality and trajectory that can no longer be dismissed or avoided in any way. If we were to look at the social movement of the United States or even in European Union, for instance, occasionally from time to time, there is that effort to try to revisit history in order to look at certain aspects of the history as undesirable. And that is known as the woke movement. In other words, some students in the United States, in European Union, may try to look at Columbus, for instance, Vasco da Gama, or other colonial ventures, and then they'll come to the eventual conclusion that these were not people that they should admire at all. With regards to Admiral Zheng, I think he falls into a very special and unique bracket in this part of the world. That unique bracket is that his legacy, whether we are looking back or looking forward, will not be experiencing that woke movement. In other words, no one will be able to criticize Admiral Zheng, whether it is the time to come or the century to come, that he hasn't done anything positive for Southeast Asia, for China, for East Africa, for the Indian Ocean per se. That having been said, now, Why am I so confident? Because it wasn't easy to create a regional entity such as ASEAN. Way back in 1967, on August 8, Southeast Asia was known as the potential Balkans of the region. In other words, the growth of nationalism and ethno-nationalism was constantly simmering that can trigger an explosion all across the region. But if we look at what we have right now, ASEAN has actually raised ahead of European Union as the one regional organization that has everything to look up to. The academic literature often says that the second most successful regional organization in the world is ASEAN. In other words, European Union, and then followed by ASEAN. But if you were to look at the reality in the recent weeks, things are changing very, very quickly. Some students that I brought from University of Malaya have posed the questions to me. Professor Kim, Professor Fa, we have enrolled ourselves in MA in European Studies. Is there a likelihood that within the year, the European Union will be dissolved? And the fear is real. The fear is extremely real because United States is no longer interested in backing and sponsoring European Union or even North Atlantic Treaty Organization. However, that fate, that destiny is not the verdict that can be rendered on ASEAN today. On that basis, we should be very proud of the fact. Now, regardless of where we are from, ASEAN does not really belong only to Southeast Asia. ASEAN has dialogue partners from different parts of the world with comprehensive strategic partnership. Allow me to enumerate them in my capacity as the former director of Security and Political Community in ASEAN. You have Australia, which was the first dialogue partner of ASEAN in 1974. And Australia played a very significant role, not unlike Zheng. In the case of Australia, it was Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, a very good friend of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who helped Vietnam to resolve the conflict, to end the war in Cambodia, Australia. And they were the dialogue partner in 1974. You then have Canada and New Zealand joining ASEAN as the third and the second dialogue partner. From that point onwards, once the system was created, you have the likes of China, Japan, South Korea, United States, and most recently, United Kingdom, especially after exiting from Brexit, immediately latching on to the chair of the Sultan of Brunei in ASEAN to be the immediate and most important member of the ASEAN dialogue system, despite the fact that since 1999, ASEAN has actually placed a moratorium on the admissions of dialogue partners into the system. Regardless, now, you then have New Zealand, Russia. All those leaders will be gathering in Kuala Lumpur, either by the end of October or early November. However, the first leader of the dialogue system that will be appearing in Malaysia soon, according to my information, but probably Ambassador Dato' Abdul Majid Khan knows better. President Xi Jinping will be coming to Malaysia on April 15, 16, and 17. And that will be one of the most strategic moments in history of diplomacy and international relations that has been pioneered by Admiral Zheng. If one were to look at the speeches of if one were to look at the speeches of President Xi Jinping with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim in April 2023, when Prime Minister made a visit to China, the first mention of Admiral Zheng He's legacy and importance comes up very quickly in President Xi Jinping's speech and engagement to Prime Minister Anwar together with the rest of his cabinet members. And this is not a one-off occasion. As and when any Chinese diplomatic personnel, regardless of rank, position, and importance, were to speak about China and Malaysia, again, the name of Admiral Zheng He would come up time and again. What is unique about our modern evaluation, especially within the context of Tawhidic epistemology, is to make the role of Zheng He even more complete. One, he was a Muslim. Two, he was a Muslim who rose to the highest station of the Ming dynasty or the Ming emperor, and he served two Ming emperors. Three, when he actually conducted one of his voyages out of the 7 voyages, when he reached areas that was very close to the section known today as Bangladesh, he actually entrusted the responsibility of someone from that region completing the Hajj on his behalf. 4. Admiral Zheng He is also very important to us and to our geopolitical and geoeconomic journey ahead, precisely because of what has happened since April 2nd. Because that was the day that was supposed to be the Independence Day of the United States. But that day has become a black mark on the diplomatic history and journey of the United States, precisely because for the first time in the history of a free trade superpower, all forms of taxations, even baseline taxation of 10%, are imposed on friends and foes alike, with President Trump actually explaining to global audiences that the likelihood of the friends betraying the United States are actually higher than any one country. So we are now entering a very peculiar situation where we have a lot to learn from Admiral Zheng He, and we can decide whether we want to Islamize him as one of the earliest Muslim envoy, or do we want to understand him strictly from the Sino-Sinic Chinese standpoint? Not very different from what Zhou Enlai did when he went to Tanzania and actually extend a very warm hand of friendship to President Julius Nyerere, whose legacy has remained in that part of East Africa. In fact, when anyone speaks about Belt and Road Initiative, East Africa is one of the most important sections that covers BRI. Now, we are actually gathered among students, diplomats, scholars, practitioners, but our common purpose has been defined by Professor Osman Bakar. How do we actually create a dialogical community that is based on concepts such as Tawhidic epistemology? Based on what I understood from Prof. Osman Bakar, Tawhidic epistemology is actually formed on the basis of 3 research institutes that can actually pulsate the production of knowledge from within IIU. One is the Institute of Future Studies, which is led by Dr. and Professor Ziauddin Sadar, the very distinguished gentleman rocking back and forth from that section. 2, the Institute of the Center for Peace and Research and Xenophobia, which is being led by Dr. Daniel Yusuf, or Professor Dr. Daniel Yusuf. Probably he's sitting in front of me. And third, there is an element of vested interest here. I'm supposed to be creating the Institute of International and ASEAN Studies, known as INTAS. Inshallah, when that is formed, you have a triangular of organizations that can help Professor Osman Bakar and International Islamic University to produce that momentum to create a dialogical community that is based on Tawhidic epistemology. In other words, something that is holistic. Now, just before I end, allow me to say that European Union will not be dissolved, it will be weakened. ASEAN will not be dissolved just because you have the likes of Vietnam being imposed with 46% of taxation, Laos being the same because they have the largest trade deficit with the United States. One of the reasons why their trade deficits with United States have increased tremendously is because in 2018, when President Donald Trump imposed taxation of 20% on China, Chinese factories relocated themselves to Vietnam, to Laos, even some of them to Thailand. And these are three of the ASEAN countries that have been hit with massive taxation on top of the 20% that haven't been removed at all. So what we are looking at right now is the potential or the potentiality that history may be moved back 100 years to 1930, when the introduction of the Smoot-Hawley Act actually imposed taxations on almost 120,000 items, leading to a Great Depression. When I said that we are in a very peculiar moment, what I meant to say is that never in the history of modern diplomacy or economics have any leaders actually said it so clearly and loudly that he is not afraid of a recession. That word has been enunciated by Donald Trump again, and again. Ronald Reagan once said, a recession is when your neighbor loses a job. A depression is when you lose your job. We are actually looking at something very serious that is confronting the world. What is fortunate about Malaysia, and this comes back to the point of Prof. Imtiaz, Malaysia is one of the most developed countries in the Muslim world. I have my doubts, but allow me to say this. Malaysia is very lucky because 67% of our electrical products exported to the United States have been exempted from the heavy taxation that has been imposed on Malaysia recently. These are semiconductors, chips, integrated circuits that are being produced in Penang, Bulim, or potentially in Selangor or even in Sarawak, 67%. 1% of our palm oil is actually sold to the United States each year. Out of that 1%, it will experience massive taxation. But other than that, aside from the message or the speech delivered by the Prime Minister earlier, there was actually a second one that he delivered at the same event yesterday, where he actually said Malaysia will not be facing any severe economic difficulties, but all the trading partners of Malaysia will be significantly weakened. And this message is totally consistent with the message of Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, because just as Singapore's GDP is exposed to global disturbances up to about 360%, Malaysia's GDP is also extremely vulnerable to the magnitude of about 200% to any external shocks and events across the world. So internally, while Malaysia's relationship with the United States will not be significantly affected, but we are also gifted with the opportunity to be the leader, to speak on behalf of the Muslim world and even on the behalf of ASEAN and East Asia and our dialogue partners, that there is really nothing to fear about the taxation if you really know how to evaluate and understand the issue on trade deficit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Far Kim Mang. I just a few comments. First, a joke, in Tanzania, we have a Lake Victoria, which was found. And when you go to Tanzania and you ask who founded Lake Victoria, they say David Livingstone. So we say, was it not there before? David Livingstone. So you very well connected as an international relations expert and strategic studies, the connection between ASEAN, Zheng, ASEAN, and China, and the coming visit of the Prime Minister of China. And you also showed to us how vulnerable, in a way, the region is, but at the same time, it has a potential of withstanding the challenges which are coming in terms of the tariff war. But without going much into that, I liked your connection, and I also see that is what's happening in IIUM since Rector Professor Usman took over, is that we have the concept of Madani, presented by Dato Siri Anwar Ibrahim, which dovetails with the concept of Tawhidic epistemology as a part of the ASEAN religio-political geographical landscape. And also, I'm sure Professor Usman agrees with me that when he talks about ummatic excellence, he is not talking in terms of exclusivism. Ummatism as a inclusive concept. And we have Professor Yasser Auda here, expert on Quran. Ummatic understanding or ummatic excellence does not mean exclusivism. Rather, it means inclusivism, because Islam is an inclusive religion. Without that identity, Islam loses its trademark in the history of religions. Thank you very much. Now we have run over time a little bit. We can have 10 minutes of discussion. So we'll take a few questions. Yes, Professor Yasser Auda. And please direct to whom you are questioning.
That's not
Question, no? There's a break. We'll take few questions and then go for break. Later? Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
It's okay, bro. So thank you so much to all our panelists and our moderator. By the way, we're gonna have our tea break now.
Okay.
And after this, we are going to have our discussions.
All right, all right. Okay.
So ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a short break, about 15 minutes. We have some tea for you at the banquet hall. It's now 11:04, so please try to make it back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Sorry, nak tanya, boleh pakai password internet ke?
Password internet. Yes.
I guess.
Saya pun tak alamak orang ITD tu dah tak ada.
Ada.
Dr. Adli, kalau nak pakai ini guest IUM punya
Wi-Fi? Boleh pakai ke? Orang periksa yang boleh. Itu makan sekali kan? Dengan Dr. Adli. Lepas tu think tank tu apa jadi dah? Saya orang aktif lah. Tony, apa khabar?
Habis penat Nori?
Oh ya.
Dia dah lama, tenang. Ya, dia tu penat tu. Penat Syahan. Betul. Yalah, ramai ah. Tak apa.
dialogue and roundtable discussion.
Eat food. Very boring. But you cannot buy.
We have come to our focused dialogue and roundtable discussion, which will be moderated by Brother Arif Subhan Arman. This session includes 3 thematic dialogues. Number 1 is Madani in Theory and Practice, the early Muslim Ummah and its implications for ASEAN and China. The second one is Islamic-Confucian Dialogue, bridging philosophical traditions and cultural exchange, and Zheng's legacy beyond diplomatic and cultural connectivity, social and economic dimensions. So the floor is yours, Brother Arif.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin al-Fatih lima ughliq wal khatim lima sabaq nasir al-haq bil haq wal hadi ila siratikal mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi wa miqdarin azim. Zheng. Oh. Welcome and a very good morning to everyone, Professor Osman, distinguished guests. Today, we are at the part of the focused dialogue and roundtable discussion of our session today, and we have the themes written on the screen, which is Madani in Theory and Practice, the early Muslim Ummah and its implications for ASEAN and China, Islamic-Confucian Dialogue, bridging philosophical traditions and cultural exchange, as well as Zheng's legacy beyond diplomatic and cultural connectivity, social and economic dimensions. So we've heard earlier on about the importance and significance of a great man, Zheng, or in schools we know him as Laksamana Cheng Ho. We've seen the trajectory of history and how the relations between Malaysia and China have been strong, also in part because of Zheng. And we have now also gone back to history to understand the significance of his voyages into this region. And one of the points that we've kind of encountered is the fact that Zheng was part of the Ming Dynasty from 1371 to 1433, whose expeditions spanned the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the African coast. But there is a question that needs to be asked, which is there a symbolic assertion of China's power and hegemony? And with that, I'd like to ask Professor Ma about this. The fact that, is it a symbolic assertion of China's power and hegemony in terms of Zheng's legacy?
Well, I think the question really depends who you ask. Just like, when you talk about all ancient empires, from Mughals, Ottomans, for all these empires, you definitely have certain hegemony there. But when we talk about Zheng legacy, especially outside China, Southeast Asia, so we really look at his contribution. For example, when you look at Zheng, we not simply talk about his Chinese or not. That's kind of a racist term if you want. His Muslim or Christian, that's a debate. Some people still say, well, he visits, Buddhist temple or something. True, he's a government official. You have to visit all, right? So I think the real contribution Zheng made, first of all, I really want to raise geographic issue. Before the Mongol time, when you look at Southeast Asia, I don't think there were a lot of, transportation through today Singapore or Malacca Strait. Before Yuan Dynasty, when you look at China, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Indian Ocean, you have to cross southern Thailand. You do not really have direct maritime route. You have to go through South China Sea to Cambodia and Chiapa, all the way to southern Thailand. Then you have to land it somewhere in today's southern Thailand. Then you have to cross Malay Peninsula. That's why you have all these key points, in West Malaysia today. So that's a contribution we talk about. Second, I think we talk about his contribution, like the rise of coastal cities. Not only like Malacca, exactly after Zheng, navigation, you see the rise of Malacca. You also see the rise of Java cities, especially Surabaya and other cities around. So that's a contribution. It's nothing to do with politics, right? Then we also see prosperity of commerce, trade. And even when you look at some specific, food, fruits, I think, for example, even like religious terms, I think in Malay language, people say lipai. Say, what does it mean? That's simply Chinese, means Korean. A lot of scholars try to find, this origin in Sri Lanka or other, countries. No, it's Chinese totally. But when you look at other way, the Malay food, there's a type of tempeh. I don't know if you guys know it, eat, drink. Yeah, let's find in 15th century Chinese port official in Palembang. By the way, Palembang is wrong. It's nothing to do with Sumatra. It's actually somewhere in southern Thailand. Palembang, Chinese capital there, sent out this tempeh to Liugu as a present. And even today in China, Chinese Muslims still eat a lot of tempeh. So you see how deep the influence between Malay, China, or Southeast Asia, and China was and still is. So that's a contribution we talk about. It's nothing to do with hegemony. But if you talk from Chinese perspective, you may have other explanations. But again, as I said, this is a shared legacy, right? We talk about all these contributions in Southeast Asia. And even if you think about historically, if you study history, without the Zheng navigation, I tell you, you cannot even find a text. You cannot have Ma Huan, you cannot have Fei Xin, you have other, his chronicles to document the major cities, peoples, customers from Surabaya all the way to East Africa. So that's a contribution and legacy we talk about. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm curious to also ask, perhaps it's a bit of a segue from our discussion, but in terms of how Zheng He is understood in China, like in schools, do students learn about his legacy in this region?
Well, even in Ming Dynasty, immediately after his voyage, Chinese court officials began to burn his documents, right? So, of course, you can understand in the following dynasties, sometimes you celebrate, sometimes you don't. That's very normal. But I think as I would say, a world-famous figure, Zheng He is really celebrated in China. And of course, I remember we talk about China, we talk about Maritime. Before the European arrival to China, Chinese focus actually is always on Eurasian continent. So that's why you have great heroes from, northern China, right? Not really from southern China. But I think in 15th century, actually before 17th century, Zheng He was really talked about by Chinese scholars. We talk about Southeast Asia, you have to talk about Zheng He. So, it's celebrated, but depends when and where.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to Professor Kim Beng about, you mentioned earlier about some figures who had to go through some revisionist ideas of history. Then case in point is perhaps Cecil Rhodes, who at Oxford, now has a bit of an issue when it comes to the scholarships because of the colonial past. And then we look at Malaysia, we have the ideas of, Zheng He's expeditions of peace, and we have texts like When China Ruled the Seas, the Treasure Fleet of the Dragon Throne, which was written by Louis Levat's, and also Gavin Menzies, 1421, the year China discovered the world. So my question is with regards to your brief yet concise essay and how Zheng He's voyage into this region is very different from perhaps the British or the Spanish and Portuguese. And also, in fact, with regards to whether or not there was a sort of changes or interaction between religions as part of the Islamic-Confucian dialogue.
If I can have the indulgence of the moderator, could you kindly put it to me one more time? Because I was in the midst of answering a message from one of the key people here. Yeah, but if you put it to me, I'll explain it.
Basically, the
Yeah.
question is.
The difference is extremely vast. I'm not even sure if I should call it difference, because it's two complete modus operandi completely. In the case of Western voyages, whether they are Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, German, British eventually, they were all very colonial in nature. But in the case of Zheng He, there was tremendous self-restraint. The only one comment that I can actually introduce on Zheng He's voyage is that there are doubts as to whether the length of the ship was exactly 400 feet, which is actually the full length of a football field. Because some scientists have actually tested on that theory using the materials of that time, and they felt that the ship cannot float at that length. However, if you reduce it to 300, then the voyages still can complete whatever that has been shown to you on the screen. Now, if we were to go back to the scholarship of Professor Wong Gong-Wu, whose stature is almost similar to Prof. Osman Bakar and Professor Tu Wei Ming, he came to University of Malaya 12 years ago. And I think Prof. Osman Bakar probably was there in the auditorium. And he gave a very splendid blow by blow, century by century explanation as to how the Spanish first came to various parts of the world, Latin America. In the case of Asia, there was the Philippines. On each and every endeavor, there was violence involved. In fact, the conflict in Mindanao right now is empirically the longest conflict in the world. And it's still simmering to this very day. And that's because of the legacy of the Spanish conquests, because due to their tendency to evangelize, to try to impose the religion. In the case of Admiral Zheng He's voyage, it was comprised of people from different religion and plural background. There were Muslims, there were Confucianists, there were other Taoists, and people of other belief. With Spanish, Portuguese, and other voyages, it was just one single religion trying to impose itself on the rest of the world. So I do want to thank you for that question. But when you look at it critically and empirically, I'm not even sure if we can compare them, because Zheng He's voyage is completely of a different magnitude and nature. Thank you.
Look at the Quran and the Surah Al-Baqarah of Khalifa, vicegerency, and he represented that kind of vicegerency in this earth. And I think making the distinction between both Spanish and Portuguese expansion with Zheng He is probably a bit problematic on my end, I guess. I'd like to actually now open the floor to questions, because I think people have pressing concerns and questions that they'd like to ask. So please keep your questions brief, and please introduce yourself before the questions. Yeah. Yep, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Osman, for this invitation and the chance to hear from colleagues on issues that are of great importance to all of us in the next few years. I'm Dr. Azhari Karim. I've been teaching a subject called cultural diplomacy for the Foreign Ministry for a number of years already. And I felt I wanted to make a comment related to cultural, and how the present government, in understanding what Madani would mean eventually upon it being translated into Malaysia, would feel that without an understanding of culture, and judging from what has been said around the room, it plays a very essential part of our civilizational development all along. Southeast Asia, particularly, and Malaysia, have been the subject of various colonial ins and outs. And eventually, this has led to what we call a cultural disposition of some sort, both beginning from the Persians, the Iranians, the Yemenis. Then you have the Europeans, then you have the British, then you have from the East, you have the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, Indonesians, and so on and so on. So eventually, culture has come to play a very important role in the development of our civilizational understanding. So it explains in deep importance on why our present Prime Minister is coming up with the Madani concept of government, because there is a relationship that is vital coming from the understanding of the deep roots of culture that are left behind or that are taken away as soon as the colonial power left the country. But I believe working on this too, the present PM has worked out a formula by which through Madani, he hopes to what we would call continue with the culturalization of the people in the region because of history, because of economics, and because of political. Without understanding of our culture and why we are different or why we are the same, I guess the road towards understanding of the civilizational dialogue will be a little bit difficult. We can then assume, oh, we have been culturalized by the British, so we are more British than British. We have been culturalized by the Filipinos, we are more Filipinos than Filipinos. So that can happen. And it's already happening in some countries. So I compared this with what PMX, President Prime Minister, and what Trump has been doing. There is a relationship between the approaches of the two heads of government. For us, it's a question of how far can we culturalize, which means we improve or we make it better from what we have been through as the people in the region, or Malaysia to be specific. Or have we also forgot and instead went out completely and deculturalized? So we have to be aware about how far we can culturalize and how far back do we want to deculturalize. The two has not met yet. And I think our efforts in this regard, as said by our colleague this morning, could well be the forerunner of what's coming up in the future. If the Prime Minister said that his source is from Madani, then I believe he has a good point there to begin with. But that's the start of bringing together people of different descent, people of religions, different religions, building up a civilization that later on became very Islamic and now is global in nature. Right. So I believe his approach, to put it briefly, is to start from outside in and not from in going to outside. Inshallah.
Thank you very much. Professor? Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. My name is Jasser Oda. I am a professor fellow at IIUM. And I would like to start by thanking all the panelists for a fascinating journey, really, that we had with geography and history and politics and the economics of the relationship in this region. Very informative. And perhaps I add a little comment to highlight and acknowledge a very new dialogue that we've been witnessing in the past year and a half, a dialogue with the youth in China who call themselves netizens or internet citizens, who are actually supporting the Palestine cause even more than many Arabs, to be frank, and I come from the Arab world. Their labeling or the name that they gave the dandelion fighters and the celebration they made for Sinwar and others on the Chinese media, the pushback that they did on the narratives of the occupying forces in Palestine in terms of the false narratives and the beheaded babies and so on and all of that, and how the Chinese netizens actually are the ones who contributed that pushback on these narratives on the Chinese TikTok, on the Bilibili, the YouTube, the China equivalent of YouTube, and the way they described the resistance as dandelion for two reasons. One is because they resemble, the seeds of the dandelion resemble the parachutes that were used by the resistance, and the dandelions, they said, never die. So the multi-million kind of ads that they put in support of the Palestinian cause my mother, I turn now into a dandelion and I will never die, and I will be flying and put my seeds somewhere else. And these kinds of rhetoric that the netizens in China have contributed greatly. So this is a very modern and very new dialogue for peace and for collaboration, and not on common grounds of religion necessarily or history, but rather a common ground of values of justice and liberation and so on. So I really, in this context, I wanted to acknowledge the Chinese youth for their contribution to the Palestinian cause. Barakallahu fiik.
Thank you, Professor Jasir Oda. And it's very important because, I think even in Japan, I have a friend who has SOAS as well. And in Japan, they have protests almost every week about the issue in the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah. May I?
Please, Tan Sri.
Congratulations to UIA for this very timely discourse. My point is this: we have been looking at it from the historical perspective in the course of the discussion. I'm more interested, perhaps, for us to look at the dynamics of change. You know, the whole ecosystem, the whole geopolitics, the whole dimension of cultural intercourse, etc., have dramatically different from what happened in the past. Firstly, it's about what is happening to the unipolar power of the USA, now probably bipolar, and probably China will be the next power base. And the Indian Ocean is now probably overcome or overtaken by events like One Belt, One Road. The Silk Road is coming into the system. Now we need to look at all this, where Malaysia is with Madani and the Prime Minister being the chair of ASEAN for this particular period, to capitalize on the new future dimension. So using that as a basis of what is now the changes that have taken place, and then on cosmopolitanism, for example, whether that in itself is now being practiced, or is it still an ideology but misplaced? You look at what happened to Palestine, all the fights that's happening there and all the struggle, who on earth from the Muslim world itself, for example, stand up and question where is this so-called ideology of cosmopolitanism? It's not there. So what I'm saying is, whatever ideology that's now prevailing, we need to look at it critically and see whether it prevails and effectively been undertaken by the UN that practice this and other big powers, or whether we need to raise our voice and put a stop to something that is going against the very ideology of cosmopolitanism.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Yes, perhaps we'll go to the gentleman over there. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for this all fruitful lectures. But I want to just ask this exploration of Zheng. It was much highlighted for the maybe show the power of China, but none of them I hear anything. As I was teaching long time this thing, because Yang Lu or Yang Li, the Chinese emperor Ming Dynasty, he started or he compelled to send him because Central Asia, the trade relation embargo was done by Amir Taimur in Central Asia. And Amir Taimur stopped Chinese goods to going in Central Asia or further Muslim countries. China has no option to sell their goods or all these things. To explore these things, Yang Li, the ruler who employed this Zheng He, and Zheng He came through this way and on the way, first, second, third, seven he did. But this part of them, I didn't hear anything. We were talking only exploration of this, but the main reason behind this project was the Amir Taimur, Central Asian ruler, because he was so powerful and he conquered most of the part. Even 1398 in India, he went to Delhi. So that part of there, and even we go to the other areas, Timur. So that was the main reason Zheng He was sent there. That's why, is there any explanation I want to know here from the audience?
Who would you like to direct the question to?
I don't know who's talking. When three people talk and think that is suitable, they can answer.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say controversial, because when you talk about Timur-Lenk actually, of course, we know he prepared to conquer China. That's the typical grand theory about Central Asia. But the reality is, if you look at the beginning of Ming Dynasty, I tell you, the Ming Emperor and the Timur-Lenk, they even changed the view on religion, God. And also, the Chinese ambassador to Timor-Leste, actually also Muslim, from Jinan. So actually, if you visit Jinan, there's a very famous mosque. His descendant actually to be imam of the mosque. So the earliest, Sufi mosque possibly in Jinan is run by his descendant. So that's why if you read the very famous text, the Timor-Leste ambassador to China, I forgot the title, the Niyaz ambassador, I think in 1421 or somewhere. 15 or 21. He visited Beijing when Beijing was established immediately. There was a fire. He documented all this incident. And he even mentioned there's so many Muslim officials in Beijing, so friendly. So we really don't know why people develop this kind of theory, say Timor-Leste stop the Chinese from going to, West. That's totally wrong, I would just say. Yes. Yeah, that's true. He prepared, 200,000 troops try to conquer China. That's, I would say, West China. I really believe he probably tried to conquer Turfan. That's the end. It doesn't mean Timur-Lenk will go to Beijing or Nanjing. That's nobody have any evidence, because Xinjiang at that time part of Turkic world. That's reasonable for him to take over Turfan. Even later on, other Islamic powers, including Khalkans. That's why you have Yaqubi invasion of Xinjiang, right? So nobody really said Timur-Lenk want to conquer China. No, there's no such story.
Perhaps we can also interact after the session as well, because I think there are also other questions that would like to be asked. Yes.
Just now, Professor Dr. Osman said something about the Indian Ocean being a zone of peace, dialogue, and prosperity. So I would like to ask, how can this be achieved when America has that Diego Garcia base there, and what America is like now? So how can you achieve that zone of peace?
Okay, thank you for your question. Well, that's why when we talk about global politics, geopolitical considerations, there is the normal approach adopted by nation states, right? And what you're proposing in the light of this mainstream thinking about how to deal with the world, how to deal with the world order, through the normal diplomacy, digital diplomacy, through negotiations, political negotiation. Everything is there, many economic, military, and so on. But one element, very important element, is missing. And that is the cultural dimension, the civilization dimension. That's all. In my case, my interest is precisely, I'm interested in looking at a world order from another perspective, the perspective of civilizations, dialogue of civilizations, not clash of civilization. So that's why in my speech earlier, I concentrate on that. All right. But of course, you have to know history. In my inaugural lecture at Georgetown, after discussing with Professor Wall, I talk about the three three major ways of globalization. From the first one, when Muslims rule the waves, not in military terms, but in cultural terms, in terms of trade. The word, of course, not used at the time free trade, but there was the spirit of those centuries, from the 9th century until the 15th century, until the Portuguese time. It was free trade. All right. The quarrel between the sultans of the various islands in the Malay archipelago with the Portuguese is because, and the Dutch, because all this while we believe in free trade. Why should you stop us from trading with the other islands, the inter-island trade? Now you want to monopolize everything. So basically, that was the second wave. The second wave of realization is when the free trade, as understood and practiced by Muslims, so the dominant party at the time, all right, and the Western, the coming of the Western colonial powers, it was based on monopoly of trade, right? And until now, it's very interesting that recently the Prime Minister of Singapore, William Wong, Lawrence Wong, he said that what Trump is doing is turning upside down the entire the system of free trade that we have. You know. Of course, he was talking about free trade, the post-Islamic free trade. Yeah, but right now he's having doubt whether our world trade pattern is going to be any better. It's going to be worse. So in this context, in talking about the new Indian Ocean, let's talk about the Indian Ocean. Peace, dialogue, and prosperity together. Of course, prosperity means common prosperity, not the prosperity of the few, but the prosperity of everyone. So, I mean, how? It's not a magic wand. This is not magic wand. We, individuals, nations, communities, now start to look at the present and future world order from a new perspective. And that perspective is dialogicalism, dialogue. So that when we talk about Madani, it's not the exclusive Madani, it is the Madani that is to be found in all cultures and civilization. That we have to study that. Yeah, we look at the universal meaning of Madani, and then we find that actually that Madani content is to be found in other religions and cultures as well. Thank you.
With due respect to the questions of Prof. Asari and then also the sister, but I'll try to reverse the order with due respect. With regards to the issue of an American military base, Diego Garcia, in Indian Ocean, whether that is actually a hindrance to the reality or the practicality of creating the zone of peace, dialogue, and prosperity within Indian Ocean? That's a very good question. However, diplomatic practices over the last 57 years have preceded the question that you just asked. The zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, which is ZOPFAN in Southeast Asia, is premised on two basic concepts. One, the member states of ASEAN shall not actively or covertly support the opposition party of another country. Two, which comes together with the first one, no member states of ASEAN shall openly or covertly criticize the military alliance of another member states. So when you have a military base, Diego Garcia, which I believe belonged to the British and which was leased back to the American only recently, it doesn't neutralize or cancel out what Professor Osman Bakar just explained, precisely because the zone of peace, freedom, of neutrality in Southeast Asia, for instance, have those inconsistency or seemingly anomalies too. You have military alliance between Cambodia and China, which no one's actually criticized openly or covertly, and therefore you have peace. You have Philippines and United States having its own military alliance, but you don't see Malaysia criticizing Philippines constantly. So ASEAN has actually perfected that method of having diplomacy that allows countries to coexist. And this is where Madani comes in. In his interview with Eric Lee, one of the leading reformist voices in China, Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim explained to Mr. Eric Lee, when it comes to Madani, what he is trying to explain is that in any kind of reform or even exertion, jihad, the element of Madani or civil or compassion must always come in. In other words, flexibility. What do you mean by flexibility? Flexibility basically means dialogue. So for instance, when I sense that your questions can actually neutralize or cancel out what Professor Osman Bakar just said, I come into the equation, the picture, and try to give you a more objective evidence, which I hope is convincing. Coming to Dr. Azari, ASEAN has a very unique interpretation of the word cultural diplomacy. So ASEAN's cooperation is divided into politics, economics, and social-cultural pillar of cooperation. When it comes to social-cultural pillar of cooperations, I have asked my officers in ASEAN before, when I was in Jakarta, what do you mean by social-cultural diplomacy? Does it mean that we just keep talking? No. In ASEAN Charter, agreed in 2007 and 2009, which was the case of Indonesia, social-cultural diplomacy basically means preparedness for any kind of humanitarian disasters that might occur when you need to rush to your neighbor, when they are experiencing the aftermath of earthquakes, tsunami. Now, here is where Tawhidic epistemology might work. Because even though Diego Garcia was considered the military base, during the onset of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, it was actually the American naval fleet that launched the first humanitarian rescue operation, 2004. So in other words, even though America clearly can have adversarial and even huge animosity against the whole world, against its own friend, this is also one of those moments when we have to capitalize by working with the likes of, say, China, India, Singapore, our friends and partners in ASEAN. There is some forces in Washington, D.C. that is not working coherently. And as I speak right now, the stock market in Wall Street is crashing, and there are protests emerging in various parts of Washington, in America right now, as I speak. Not massive. So again, there is also another reflection of the Madani in America. They have selected a president, but they now have what is known as the buyer's remorse. They really regret that they have selected and elected President Trump as the 47th president, because they do not like what they see in America and across the world right now. I hope that answers both your questions and the question of Tan Sri from Mubarak. Thank you.
Just adding to what Professor Kim just said, you reminded me of our common friend, Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, the former foreign minister of Thailand, and also the Secretary General of ASEAN. At one of the conferences in Bangkok, Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, I'm quoting him verbatim, he said, ASEAN moves at a speed comfortable to all. This is a principle which you are alluding to. And talking about the Madani concept, when Nargis happened, the Nargis cyclone happened in Myanmar, which took a lot of lives. Here was Surin Pitsuwan, Abdul Halim, a Muslim, who told Myanmar to open the doors so that the relief can come in from all the countries. And Qatar was the first country to send relief to Myanmar. So you see that civilizational, cultural dimension which Professor Dato Osman is talking about and the Prime Minister is talking about is in place, but we don't see it because we don't see it through on the media. Al Jazeera, sorry there, doesn't bring that kind of aspect, of how ASEAN interacts internally within themselves cohesively, but it doesn't get shown. Just wanted to share this thought with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry to cut the queue, but I'd like to ask a quick question. My name is Jen. I'm from Taylor's University. I'm doing research on food sociology, specifically durian, but this is not the point of the question. Even though it was written that Zheng He tried durian and there were some historical things about it. I really appreciate the very somewhat heated and interesting political debates, but I'm going to take my question a bit further back into history. I'd like to know your opinion of what was the concept of identity before European colonialism in Nusantara. Because when we see historical incidents that happen, for example, what it means to be Chinese in Malaysia now is different from the time when Zheng He arrived in the Malay archipelago. So I'm just very curious, because we talk also about cosmopolitanism, how were non-locals, non-Bumiputra, I mean, I know Bumiputra is a recent term, how were they perceived, treated, and accepted by locals, and what was the level of acceptance? What was the integration? And, for example, like Zheng He arrived, but part of his identity was being Muslim. So maybe that had something to do with it. So I'd like some opinion about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I have two points. First, basically, you asked the identity. What was the identity of basically the archipelago, the Malay archipelago, before the coming of the colonial power, starting with the Portuguese? Well, the entity is nothing than that word Nusantara, which is popularly used but not really explained what's the meaning of Nusantara. Yeah? World Spirit is Nusantara. They call it in Nusantara. Nusantara, in terms of etymology, is simply inter-island. Nusa is land, Tara is inter, from the Sanskrit word. So Nusantara means inter-islands. So basically the culture was based on relationships. Okay, it's a free movement, mobility from between the islands. There was the identity, something like the common market, the European common market. They practice that. Second point, which I think is very important, not meant to mention it, because I earlier mentioned the three waves of globalization. That was the global perspective. So the first wave, from the 9th century until basically the end of the 15th century. The end of 15th century. The Portuguese came in 1511, which is already early 16th century. Now, the key here to understand is the significance of this Zheng He voyages outside China to South Asia, the continuity of the first wave of globalization. Zheng He was part of that first wave, which was, I call, the Islamic era wave. In other words, when the biggest ships from the Malay world, the biggest ships from the Middle East, the biggest ships, basically from Persia and so on, from the Persian Sea, they went to trade to China. That could not have been missed. That scenery could not have been missed. That element, all the biggest ships in the world went to China for trade. that could not have been missed by the emperor of that time. So in other words, the kind of competition for trade was there. And that's my response to that question. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think Professor Osman theorized all this, Southeast Asian identity, but I can provide some concrete evidence, several examples. One example is before European arrival to Southeast Asia, we all know maritime terminology like Nahuda, right? That's Persian. We all know Chinese pretend to be Southeast Asians live in Java. They send tribute to China and the Chinese say, oh, you are not Southeast Asian, you're Chinese, right? And also Chinese went to Cambodia to marry local women, right? And we see even Cambodians, Thais, they went to South Korea, not South Korea, Korean Peninsula to be official. You really see huge level of mobility. Nobody really care you're Southeast Asia or, Chinese. So in this sense, I would say Southeast Asia, before the coming of European, before the formation of especially Majapahit Empire, that's an empire really without emperor. It's really like if you think about the Mongol Empire, you do have Muslim Jews, Christians to be official, Europeans, Marco Polos, right? But you do have powerful Hamid there. But in Southeast Asia, you have everyone. You can come here, you can live here, you can pretend to be Southeast Asians. When you get old, you just return to China. So I would say that's open empire without emperor. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum. Oh, sorry.
We just scan the room for a while.
At the back also, please.
All right, please.
Oh, thank you. My name is Kalina Khalili. I am from the Islamic-Confucian Dialogue Society. I have a few things to mention, but also based on the lady's question just now, it's interesting about the identity. I think there's one aspect that we haven't mentioned yet among the people of free trade. Southeast Asia was also the orang laut or the sea nomads. They are very important factors in the dissemination of trade, such as the sea cucumbers export that goes all the way from Australia to Taiwan. A lot of diving aspect that takes them to the deeper part of the South China Sea and the pearl industry. So these are people that don't appear in history because they are in between the lines. Like if you read certain books that might be considered hikayat or just folk tales, you would have them appear regularly as people who actually rescued a lot of people, much like the Bedouins of the desert of Arabia. You wouldn't be able to survive in the desert without the Bedouins. And so in Southeast Asia, where it's generally maritime, you have these nomadic people who are not mentioned. And they are now the stateless people of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. And they won't be able to tell this story because they are already forgotten and lost in the state situation. But anyway, I'm very thankful to be here today and to see the efforts towards discussion of peace. But as we can see that with the discussion of peace, there's also the discussion of war. So I'd like to bring up a professor that I used to study with before, Robert Jervis, and his idea of keeping peace is to know the deterrence factor and to be able to view the opinion, to view the actions, the carrots and sticks that are being shown by countries such as America. And I think the dialogue should be very balanced at this point. It's so dangerous if we tip to one side. We have to be, ASEAN has to be so balanced in approaching this issue and not showing any favoritism or over dialoguing with any group at the expense of the others. So may I suggest that continuous dialogue with America and to see America as not necessarily an entire body, but also factions within the nation. And even, maybe many would disagree with me, even our Jewish compatriots, because in the whole idea of discussion on Gaza, there are many people whose identity as Jewish people are being rocked by this violence. And this is our opportunity to actually dialogue with them and to remember the Islamic Tawhidic epistemology that Professor Osman Bakar, calls to, has produced in history people like Maimonides, who are Jewish and essentially imbued the Islamic philosophy within their worldview. And so that's what I see we're trying to do. And, it's a very invigorating time. Yeah, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment, sister. Much needed. I think, you mentioned very important names. I would like to move to, yes.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, moderator. I would like to bring it back to what Prof. Osman framed as a foundational, I would say, framework of the discourse. Because he used very big words: peace, zone of peace. So it has so this discourse must have certain sense of normative and the underlying normative sense. Because in order to achieve peace, I guess it must have certain sense of justice. So I would like to get panelists to enlighten us in this Zheng or Zheng legacy. Where any forms of sense of justice being asserted or being practiced? Because for me, from the era of post-World War, you are talking about liberalism. Then after you go to authoritarianism, now you are talking about nationalism. Now, what I'm researching now, something else about cyber war. Of course, I would like to see how this kind of discourse also fit the bill. Of course, for the purpose of today, I would like to bring it back. What is the underlying normative ideas of Zheng Ho journey? Is it just purely the situational thing? Yes, dialogue. Yes, dialogue for what? Where is that sense of justice that he assert in the community? And I think if we succeed to do that, he has covered almost beyond ASEAN. And Zheng Ho can be the extended BRI versions of China, maybe diplomacy, beyond diplomacy to this part of the world. So I would like to understand that, because I didn't hear anything from panel talk about normative big ideas.
Right,
because otherwise, Zheng Ho is just another situational matter.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Kim will answer the question and then we'll move on to another question from our brother here. He's been waiting. Yes.
Again, with due respect to Prof. Osman Bakar and everyone here, allow me to answer the question of Senator Yusmadi. Esteemed Senator, when it comes to the issue of justice in relations to Zheng He, allow me to go back to the concept of speech acts in international relations. When certain speech acts are made, it actually creates a normative framework as to how subsequent generations to come can behave. In the case of Zheng He, even though he said very little, but his actions and his legacy were tremendously loud and powerful, and it continues to ricochet throughout time and space to the room that we have right now. In 8 days, when President Xi Jinping comes to Malaysia, and we have to keep in mind that the President of Indonesia was just here yesterday, even President Xi Jinping himself is circumscribed by what he can and cannot do precisely because of the legacy of Zheng He. China is, without a doubt, the most powerful naval power right now, with 370 ships and likely to increase to 450 ships by 2030. China's naval power has overstripped America completely. Even though China has the largest naval fleet right now, it cannot do as it pleases precisely because of the legacy of Zheng He. That is where justice comes in. It moves slowly when it comes to international relations. That's one. Secondly, I have a student from University of Malaya who asked me if the Belt and Road Initiative that we have seen over the last decade is a reflection of Zheng He's legacy. You can say that it is, but to be more precise, there was a speech made by Deng Xiaoping, assigned by Chairman Mao to be delivered specifically at the United Nations in 1974 General Assembly. In that speech, Deng Xiaoping said there are three worlds in the whole world of international relations. You have the first world, which is primarily the West. You have the second world, which is form of Eastern European states and Soviet Union. And you have the third world. China will always stand with the third world. And one of the reasons why Zhou Enlai went to Tanzania was to create the whole process of building stadiums and some basic infrastructure in East Africa, if I'm not mistaken, with due respect to Prof. Imtiaz. So when you look at BRI, it's actually no different from China's third world theory. And this third world theory actually is premised on the fact that China will do its best to stand in the side of the South. And that's where also justice comes in, with due respect, Senator.
May I speak about
to communicate with the Muslim world. At the same time, they are suppressing the Muslims inside China. That's one aspect. The other aspects, we saw a good move from China when in Afghanistan. Once the Americans left Afghanistan, or once the invasion of Afghanistan finished, we saw that China was very proactive, is the only big power of the world who reached Afghanistan and established diplomatic relations with Afghanistan, and they were ready to make good economic relations and political relations with the new government of Afghanistan. But when what we saw in Syria, they are reluctant, they are not going ahead, maybe because it's close to Israel. And they are, when it comes to Israel, looks that China becomes like any other country in the third world countries, not proactive to challenge the superpower of the United States in the Middle East. That's, if somebody can elaborate on the challenges ahead of us. Thank you much.
For those who do not know, the question is from TV Al Jazeera.
Again, I don't mean to try to dominate or monopolize the floor. With due
Hi.
respect.
Okay, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Okay.
Just yeah. So with regards to issues of challenges, so let's use the example of U.S. military base in Qatar. There is the U.S. military base in Qatar, but that being said, Qatar is also one of the leading mediators in the whole Middle East peace process. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the world is not perfect. But even when the world is not perfect, there is always room for dialogue, for civilizational engagement. And when I see people raising hands trying to say that perhaps China is also a challenge, no doubt China can be. But even if China may behave in a manner that is chauvinistic occasionally, such as when they have ships or even planes in South China Sea, based on the feedback that I got from friends in well-placed places, whenever you speak to the Minister of Defense of China, they can actually terminate and end that behavior that is considered as aggressive. It's just not reported in the press, as what Prof. Imtiaz just said. Now, coming back to the issue of press coverage, the CGTN actually has the best coverage on the Gaza issue. I wish it's Al Jazeera, but it's not. It's actually CGTN. Why? Because CGTN has actually posed a very fundamental questions. Assuming that you have a two-state theory and we are willing to go ahead with it, but what if we just ask for one toilet from Israel? Is Israel willing to give just one toilet to the Gazan? Of course, the issue is no. But the CGTN put it in such precise manner consistently over the last 2 years. China has been consistently on the side of the Muslim world on Gaza issue. On other issues, I would have to reserve my caveat because this is not a perfect world. Now, Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim also recognized the Uyghur issue too. On record, if you Google right now, Prime Minister Anwar is one of the 2 leaders in this world that have actually touched on the Uyghur issue. He said, on certain issues that are of a very delicate nature, it has to be resolved through back-channel diplomacy. We are not in a position to impose any kind of solution, but there are efforts being conducted by responsible state, civilizational states who recognize the problem and try to resolve the issues in a very smooth and diplomatic manner. Not very different from what the late Dr. Surin tried to do when he tried to introduce humanitarian aid to Myanmar in light of the Nargis typhoon in 2009 that led to a fatality of almost 140,000 people.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, a few questions. How would you rate the meeting between our second Prime Minister, the late Tun Abdul Razak, and Chairman Mao in terms of importance of Malaysia's relationship with historical China? Number 2 is the role of BRICS. And we have a few players involved in the Zheng shipping, expeditionary process. How can this be used, this whole process of Zheng and diplomacy and trade rather than war? How can this, let's put Malaysia in the picture. How can Malaysia promote this towards our other fellow partners? We are not a full member of BRICS, but to BRICS members, particularly since there will be a new strategic policy developed by the BRICS Alliance. And finally, I have been to many, this is for Prof. Osman Bakar. I have been to many of these sessions, and I think I spoke to Prof. Ma as well. When is this dialogue thing amongst academics and intellectuals going to be opened up to the public and youth? I keep on asking this question all the time, right? So we sit here, like I'm not an academic, but I represent a foundation, right? We sit here, we discuss, we dialogue, we talk about research papers, we talk about books, we talk about theoretical journeys. When, and Prof. Osman did say IIUM has been given this task by our Minister of Higher Education. When are we going to really seriously address this with youth? I had a brief chat with one of the profs earlier, and I won't mention the name, but I've been going to China relatively often recently. I'm also in touch with like the Russians, but I noticed a new rise of a bit nervous nationalism, right, growing. And if we want to talk about the Zheng process, and I know some people just, China's like, China has its challenges as well. How can we reverse this by having more youth dialogue? I see a lot of young students from People's Republic of China here. How can we have more dialogues on the process of building global unity in a very disparate world using the Zheng experience? I think I start with Prof. Ma, and then Prof. Osman Bakar, and then like our ASEAN specialist.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for all these challenged questions. I think from my understanding, we talk about all these, intellectual discourses, right? So how can we publicize? How can we have a more, audience to participate in all these topics? I think, Yishana, hopefully, I'm thinking about in future, when we sit in a forum, we're not simply say, well, we have some, distinguished professors, thinkers to talk a big concept, theory. For example, we talk about Madani. I think the question actually is really good, just raised here. If you talk about Madani as a cultural concept, then people say, why Madani? Can you find something in Buddhism? Why not, Madani, right? You can find also in Christianity, Judaism. I think that's true. But Madani, I think, is both a theory and a practice. Without practice, it's really hard to dialogue. And so what's the purpose of a dialogue? The purpose of dialogue, of course, is for action. The action is partnership, cooperation. So that's why here for Zheng Forum, as I said, we're not simply here just have a pure talk, which actually was very popular by the end of 19th century in China, all these intellectuals, politicians to talk about future of China, right? So that's called a pure talk. But as a public forum, I think in future, especially in this July, we have a large conference. We do hope to have some, public audience, either at a big university or even some other public, place, to have more, I would say, community-based discourses. You do have intellectuals, you do have thinkers, you do have all these designers, planners, but you should really have people who have real concern about all these issues. So that's the, I think, short answer I may provide now.
Prof. Imtiaz, please.
Referring to your question, your comment, I just want to share something. We should avoid spoilers if we want to do dialogue. And this is, I'm going to say something before the scholars of Hadith jump on me. I was giving a talk on Islam and Buddhism at the University of Hong Kong, which is the top university in Asia. And I started with a slide, Utlubul ilm ilo fi Sin, seek knowledge unto China, Prophet Muhammad. The Chinese were so happy. They said, Prophet Muhammad mentioned us, but there was someone, spoiler, in the audience. He jumped on me and said, sir, this is Daif Hadith. I said, you spoiled everything. So we have this kind of antecedent precedence from Prophet Muhammad. We can build on it, but don't spoil it. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the comment.
You do first.
Okay, Professor Kim.
When Prof. Osman Bakar say you do first, he didn't know that perhaps I'll be the spoiler. The spoiler is this. To the gentleman who asked the question on the importance of Tun Razak and Chairman Mao's visit 50 over years ago. Prior to that visit, there was a lot of effort, diplomatic efforts behind the scene. Indonesians back then were not really confident of China. In our delegation, secret delegations to China prior to the meeting of Tun Razak and Chairman Mao, according to the biography of someone who has worked on that meeting, Tan Sri, whose name I cannot reveal. In that Malaysian delegation to China, there were two Indonesians who looked completely like Malays, but were included in that Malaysian delegation to China. They were given Malaysian passports just for that occasion, precisely because the new regime in Indonesia was not confident that Malaysia know how to handle China. Therefore, two Indonesian secret envoys have to be part of that Malaysian delegation to China. When they came back, and when Tun Razak eventually and Chairman Mao eventually met, Indonesia did not raise any outcry because they were confident that Malaysia was doing the right thing on behalf of Southeast Asia. And that momentum and that legacy has remained.
If I may add to all that has been said, I think China has always been a sensitive issue for Southeast Asia, for the Malays of Southeast Asia, for the Nusantara. Yeah. Certainly, I think when Tun Razak restored that diplomatic relation, there was no consensus. There's no consensus, but what prevailed is pragmatic. Pragmatic prevailed. There were still many Malays at the time. I mean, who were anti-communist, very to the core, very ideological. They always bring up the issue of what the communists have done to the country, and even right now, the moment they see the current prime minister wants to be closer to China, then suddenly hear voices of discontent, saying that, don't you remember what has happened to us? So I think this thing will go on. Yeah. So that's why I believe dialogue. So it's dialogue. Let's sit down and dialogue. Yeah. There was the time, of course, even before Zheng, when the majority, if not every kingdom, almost practically every Malay kingdom, even before Islam, the Majapahit, kingdom and so on, they had what we call today MOU. Basically, understanding for peace, all right? The Malay kingdoms will pay certain opti, bayar opti duit there, pay certain, in acknowledgement of course, China is our big brother. If not, China is our big brother, is our neighbor to the north. To believe that. So I think that factor should also be taken into consideration when to understand the Zheng thing, right? Zheng is visiting those countries, Malay countries, we are paying homage to China, yeah, in return for peace. So I think that is important. So I want to say now, brother, it's a question about this dialogue. I think we have to talk. I don't think we have to talk too much about dialogue. People think that we have talked too much. Yeah. People think that we have talked too much. Why not action? No, I said, even at the level of words, at the level of dialogue, we have not done much. Yes, true, at the level of action, it's still worse. Yeah. But the point is, let us talk, let us do. I believe in that philosophy. So if today is a dialogue, we talk about that, then I'll go back to the campus community. First of all, okay, we have listened to discussion here. It means that there are many areas where we don't know much. We have to acknowledge that we know little. But that little, we talk a lot. But now, why do we do research? We in the university should do research about past relations between the region and China, about research about Shanghai. All right? That is important. If you that spirit, yeah, departments concerned, departments related in this university, do research, all right? No money, we can talk. We can talk about that, yeah? The point is, this must be followed up by concrete things. Then we go to the youth, yeah? I know here the alumni, the president of the one alumni, there are many alumni tribes in UIA, but this is one of them. This is Khalid. He has been dialogue, taking the use of Malaysia, for example, to China. On that front, let it go on. But I'm excited now. I'm excited to share with you because it's not yet a reality, but as a result of this understanding between Presidency of China and Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia, Islam-Confucian dialogue, will there be an MOU between the two countries? And in China, ICA, International Confucian Association, will be the champion of this MOU, and IIUM will be the Malaysian champion of that. And I understand it's going to be a lot of activities. To me, there's going to be very, very interesting. It's going to be very interesting that Islam and Confucianism dialogue is going ahead, going to be even more prominent. To me, when President of China, President Xi, accepts the word Islam to be part of the dialogue, this is a great, great thing. Yeah. So we have to move forward. Yeah. In other words, now dialogue between Islam and Confucianism at the international level, at the level of the highest level. Yeah. It's not between Osman Bakar and some other. No, this is between the Prime Minister and the President of Xi, and then to talk about the implications of this dialogue for the new world order. We should not miss this opportunity. We have to talk. Yeah. So I think that this is important. So I think this what we are doing things today is something which will lead further. And I just, because we're going to close, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all. I think, but there should be something, there should be follow-up, concrete follow-ups. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Osman. We only have time for one last question, and the gentleman has been waiting for quite a while, so thank you for your patience.
I think to answer the question, we probably have one youth in here that might be able to ask a question. And because you were asking a question about when we're going to bring this to the youth. So I'm 25, and I'm going on 26, so be one of you. I'll introduce myself. I'm Aaron Shankar. I'm a theological major of St. Paul's Theological College as well. Today I'm here because I have a very burning question, and I've always been very interested in dialogue actually. So I hope to come for more Madani events. And part of my youth is also to be by nature being selfish with my question as well. So I have no contributions to anything. You guys are experts and whatnot, but in my next two thesis papers, I want to be focusing on inter-ethnic divisions. One for my master's and one for my PhD as well. So here's my question. From the perspective of Madani's government, what are the contributions of dialogue between civilizations that could help us bridge the gap within Malaysia of the inter-ethnic division in our nation? The point at the back in maroon attire, very, very profound statement you made earlier, mentioned that we should not see America as a whole, but factions within a nation we could learn from. And to some degree, in taking that into consideration, perhaps dialoguing with those factions and institutions in those differing divisions could help us bridge that gap. Since Malaysia has still a wide division and also faction of religions and ethnic groups that are internally divided from each other. This is a very burning question and central to my heart and the thesis that I hope to pursue. And I would love your input on what Madani's contributions could be on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Aaron. Aaron, was it? Aaron, thank you.
Very quickly, allow me to put further context to the importance of dialogue, concept of civilization, class of civilizations, and whatnot. Whenever we use those words, we are remembering Samuel Huntington's work back in 1993, Class of Civilization. But we should also try to understand that in that paper, he actually postulated eventually the Islamic and the Confucian world will join together and face against the West. And that prompted one of my ex-professors, still my teacher, Dr. Ahmet Davutoglu, the Prime Minister of Turkey, to heavily promote the Alliance of Civilization in United Nations together with Spain in order to make sure that civilizations can actually form into a proper alliance. Now, aside from that, there's also one reason why we should try to understand that what Professor Osman Bakar just said. Let's talk, let's research. Based on my experience in ASEAN, ASEAN is actually an organization that cannot perform and do much. And I say that without any apology. However, if you do eventually have access to ASEAN, all the notes are complete. Not a single grammatical mistake in all the thousands of meetings in ASEAN Secretariat. And there are thousands of meetings every year all across the Asia-Pacific region at track 1 and track 2. When the notes are complete, that's when all the academicians and diplomatic practitioners can spring into actions because there are records to do the necessary follow-up. We are fortunate that all the sessions today can be recorded because if I don't see anyone taking notes right now, basically, when we disperse from this room in a very short moment, nothing much will be done. That having been said, there is a Chinese saying that probably came from Zheng He. Even if it's not, let's assume that it did. Whatever you do, God is always watching. And when Chinese render that into a proverb, God is watching, it doesn't mean that God is surveilling you constantly. No. God is watching means God is encouraging you to do good. So when you are having dialogue, you should have that inner cultivation, what Wang Yangming, known as 良知, conscience, that you want to do good. Why am I speaking in such a soft voice? Because I want to engage. I do not want to advocate. Thank you very much.
I think that's the best way to end this discussion is with that reminder, alhamdulillah. So we have to be in a constant state of muraqabah, using a Sufi term. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone for being here. And inshallah, we'll see each other again. And thank you to all the panelists. Yes, inshallah, we'll see each other again. Any mistakes on my end is mine alone, and I hope to see you again. Thank you very much. Bismillah.
Okay, thank you so much, Brother Arif. And thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for all the questions and the answers from the panelists. Alhamdulillah. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of today's colloquium, we want to express our sincere gratitude to all the presenters, discussions, and participants, both here and on YouTube. And thank you for contributing to the success of this platform for this civilizational dialogue and shared wisdom. Let us close with Tasbih Kafarah and Surah Al-As. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, everyone. Oh, wait. We have a photography session. Okay, hold on. Let me call the photographers in. Okay. The audience, can you gather behind the rector? Satu muka.